And the Buddhist sleep story, why a man could never stop being angry, and what the Buddha showed him about rage. A boy stands in a courtyard with a broken jar at his feet. The water has already soaked into the dust, gone. There's nothing left to show what happened except the boy himself, 7 years old, fists still clenched, breathing like he's just run somewhere instead of standing still. His sister is laughing. Not cruelly, just the easy laugh of an older child who finds something funny and hasn't yet learned to read a room. She doesn't know what's coming. You wouldn't know either if you were standing there. A jar breaks, children laugh. It happens every day in every village that has ever existed. But watch his face. Something in it doesn't match the size of what just happened. The jar was an accident, his own elbow, his own carelessness, and yet his whole body has gone rigid with something closer to rage than embarrassment. His mother comes running. She's seen this look before. You can tell by the way she slows her steps, the way she doesn't reach for him right away. She has learned the hard way that reaching for him in this state is like reaching into a fire to rescue something that's already burned. This is the first time you're meeting him, and it will not be the last. Here's what most people miss about anger. It rarely arrives the size of its cause. A jar breaks, and somewhere underneath the breaking, an old door swings open, one that was never about the jar at all. You felt this yourself, probably more than once. A small thing happens, a dish left in the sink, a comment made at the wrong moment, and something in you responds at a volume the small thing never asked for. If you've ever wondered where that comes from, you're not alone, and you're about to watch one man's answer play out across an entire lifetime. His name, the name history remembers him by much later, when he is old and the story finally catches up to him, is Bharadvaja. But for now he is just a boy in a courtyard standing over a broken jar while his sister's laughter fades into something more careful, more watchful, because she has felt the temperature of the air change. You should know before we go further what this story is not. This is not a story about a bad man. This is not a story about a villain you're meant to despise from a safe distance. This is not a story about someone unlike you, someone whose fire you could never recognize in your own chest. This is a story about a fire that lives in every one of us, banked low most days, barely noticed. And what happened when one man's fire finally caught the wrong thing and kept catching it for decades on, until it had burned through nearly everything he loved. Stay with this for a moment, because the shape of his childhood is the shape of the whole story to come. His family were Brahmins, a household where status mattered, where the right words and the right rituals were supposed to keep a person safe from the chaos of the world. His father believed that if you said the right things loudly enough, you controlled the world around you. Mother believed something quieter and sadder, that you simply waited out whatever storm was currently moving through the house, and you cleaned up afterward, and you didn't ask why the storms kept coming. His father had not always been this way, or so the older relatives in the extended family sometimes said, in the careful, indirect way families discuss things they'd rather not discuss directly. He had inherited a position of standing that came with expectations he hadn't fully earned through his own efforts. A Brahmin status granted by birth rather than built through any particular achievement of his own. And something about the gap between the respect he believed he was owed and the respect he sometimes actually received had curdled over years into the loud, defensive certainty that became his most visible trait by the time Bharadvaja was old enough to notice it. Nobody in the family ever named this directly to the children. They simply lived inside its consequences, generation folding into generation, each one absorbing a version of the same lesson without ever being told its origin. So Bharadvaja grew up in a house where anger was the loudest language anyone spoke, and where no one ever quite explained where it came from or what to do with it. He learned the way children learn everything that matters, not from being told, but from watching. That anger was how you won. Anger was how you were heard. Anger was the proof that you mattered, that what had happened to you mattered, that you weren't going to simply absorb whatever the world handed you without making the world pay something back. Node. You could see it most clearly at the evening meal, which in most households is the quietest, most ordinary part of the day. A place to set down whatever weight the day handed you before sleep. In Bharadvaja's house, the evening meal was something closer to a held breath. His father would arrive home from settling some dispute or another, a dispute he had almost always, by his own account, won, and he would describe the victory in detail, expecting the table to receive it the way an audience receives a performance. With appreciation, with agreement, with no interruption that might be mistaken for disagreement. And if someone at the table reached for the rice at the wrong moment, or asked a question that implied the dispute might have had two reasonable sides to it, the temperature of the room would shift instantly, the way a sky shifts before a storm you can smell before you can see it. Bharadvaja, young, watching this unfold meal after meal, year after year, absorbed something that never got named out loud in his hearing. That being listened to and being feared were, in this house, functionally the same thing. Nobody ever sat him down and told him this. Nobody needed to. He simply watched what worked. He watched his father's voice rise and watched the room go still and compliant in response. And some young, half-formed part of him filed this away as a kind of instruction manual for how a man moves through a world that might otherwise ignore him. There was a particular afternoon, not the jar-breaking afternoon, a different one, smaller, almost too small to count as a memory at all, when a tutor came to the house to teach Bharadvaja and his sister their letters. The tutor was patient by most accounts, the kind of teacher who repeats an explanation as many times as a child needs without sighing about it. Bharadvaja struggled with a particular character, got it wrong 3 times in a row, and, on the 4th attempt, before the tutor could even correct him, he threw the writing tablet across the room and shouted that the lesson was stupid, that the tutor was teaching it wrong, that none of it mattered anyway. His father, overhearing this from the next room, did not scold him for the outburst. He laughed, a short, approving laugh, and said something to the tutor about how the boy clearly had spirit, clearly wasn't going to let himself be pushed around by a piece of clay and a stylus. The tutor said nothing in response, because there was nothing useful to say to a father who had just rewarded the exact behavior the tutor had been quietly hoping someone, somewhere, might eventually discourage. This is worth pausing on because it's easy, hearing a story like this, to imagine that a temper simply arrives in a person fully formed, like a birthmark. It doesn't. It's built one small reinforced moment at a time, not by people who often have no idea they're building anything at all. A father who laughs at the wrong moment. A household that goes quiet at the right moment. A pattern, repeated often enough until the child at the center of it no longer experiences it as a pattern. He experiences it as simply how the world responds to him, which is, in its own way, exactly true and exactly the problem. There's a word for what was already growing in him, even at 7 years old, even before he had any language for it. In Pali, it's called dosa, and it means more than the English word hatred can carry on its own. Dosa is the aversion that flares the instant something doesn't go your way. It's the flinch that turns into a fist. It's the part of the mind that meets the world's roughness with roughness of its own, almost before you've had a chance to choose anything at all. You'll hear this word again before the story is over. Hold on to it. Here's the part nobody tells you about a temper like this. It doesn't feel like a flaw from the inside. It feels like justice. By the time Bharadvaja was a young man, this was simply how he moved through the world. A merchant shortchanged him. Fury. And a servant was slow to bring water. Fury. A neighbor's dog barked too long in the night. Fury, loud enough that the neighbor came out with his hands raised, already apologizing for something his dog had done, as if the dog's barking were somehow his own failure as a man. People learned to give Bharadvaja room. They learned to agree with him quickly, to smooth things over before he could finish his sentence, because finishing his sentence usually meant raising his voice, and raising his voice usually meant something worse was close behind it. You've met someone like this almost certainly, maybe in your own family, maybe at work, where one person's mood decides the temperature of an entire room, and everyone else learns to read that mood the way sailors read weather, quickly, carefully, because their own safety depends on it. And if you've ever found yourself walking on eggshells around someone whose anger seemed to arrive faster than the situation warranted, now you already understand something about Bharadvaja that the rest of this story is going to slow down and look at closely. Now here's something else worth noticing. Something easy to miss if you're only watching the shouting. Bharadvaja did not think of himself as an angry man. He thought of himself as a man who simply would not be disrespected. There's a difference in his own mind, though there wasn't much difference in the lives of the people around him. He believed the way so many people believe, that his anger was a response to the world's provocations, not a quality of his own that he carried with him into every room, looking for exactly the provocation it needed to justify itself. One afternoon, on the path that ran along the river near his family's land, a younger boy from a poorer household crossed in front of him without stepping aside fast enough. It was nothing. A half-second of inconvenience. But Bharadvaja shoved him hard with both hands, and the boy went into the river, into water that was higher and faster than it looked from the bank. You'll want to know what happened to that boy. So do I. We're going to come back to him, because the river doesn't let go of what it's given as easily as Bharadvaja walked away that day, certain he'd done nothing more than teach a careless child a small lesson about manners. But let's stay with Bharadvaja a little longer first, because something is forming in him that's bigger than any single incident, a story he is quietly telling himself, underneath all the shouting about who he is and why the world keeps testing him. He believes the world is full of people who are careless, slow, disrespectful beneath him. He believes his anger is the only thing standing between himself and being treated like nothing. And he has never once considered that his anger might be the thing making people treat him carefully instead of warmly. That the room he commands through fury is not the same as a room that loves him. This is the moment everything changes. Though Bharadvaja has no way of knowing it yet, somewhere in a grove many miles from where he is standing right now, a man close to his own age has just sat down beneath a tree and refused to move until he understands something about suffering that no one in his life has ever been able to explain to him. That man will not arrive in this story for a long while yet, but you should know here at the very beginning that one day, decades from now, when Bharadvaja is old, his hair gray, his temper somehow both worn down and sharper than ever, he is going to walk into a quiet grove and scream every insult he has ever carried into the face of a teacher who will not raise his voice in return. He will come back to him, but not yet. For now you only need to know this. The fire is already lit. It was lit before he could speak. It will follow him through marriage, through fatherhood, through the slow accumulation of an entire life's worth of arguments he believed he was winning. And the question this story is going to sit with slowly, chapter by chapter, not whether Bharadvaja's anger was justified in any single moment. It's what anger actually costs the person who carries it, long after everyone around them has stopped keeping score. Notice what just happened in that courtyard all those years ago. A jar broke. A boy's body responded as though something far larger than a jar had been taken from him, and nobody, not his mother, not his father, not Bharadvaja himself, ever once asked what that larger thing might have been. His sister, watching from a few steps away as her brother stood over the broken jar, would carry her own quiet version of this afternoon for the rest of her life. Long after she'd married and left the household and built a family of her own in a quieter home, far from her brother's temper, She would remember, decades later, telling her own children about an uncle whose moods you learned to read before you learned much else about him, and she would notice telling it, and how strange it was that she still flinched slightly at the memory of her own laughter that day, an ordinary, innocent sound, a child's laugh at an accident that had somehow felt, even at the time, like something dangerous to have let out into the air. She never fully forgave herself for laughing, though there had been nothing to forgive. She had simply been a child doing what children do in a house that had quietly taught her, long before she had words for it, that even small, ordinary sounds could apparently summon something best avoided. You might already have a guess. Keep it in mind. You're going to need it before this is over. By now you've met the boy and the fire inside him. What you haven't seen yet is what that fire did to everyone standing near it once he grew old enough to have a house of his own. Bharadvaja married young, into a family that admired his confidence and mistook his temper for strength. His wife had grown up in a quieter household than his own, the daughter of a farmer whose worst moods amounted to a long sigh and an early bedtime rather than anything resembling the weather Bharadvaja's family produced. She had been drawn to him in the earliest days of their courtship, by exactly the quality that would later cost her so much. His certainty, his refusal to be pushed around by anyone, the way he seemed to move through the world as though it owed him an explanation for every inconvenience and intended to collect on the debt. At 18, this had looked like strength to her. It would take her the better part of 2 decades to understand the difference between a man who is strong and a man who is simply loud in a way that frightens people into mistaking volume for substance. She was quiet in the way that some people are quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned very quickly which words were safe to bring into a room with him and which ones would cost her an evening of silence afterward, or worse, an evening of noise. You can probably picture the kind of household this became, Ed, even without me describing every detail. A house where the air changes the moment a door opens. A house where children learn to read a parent's footsteps the way you might read weather. Heavy steps meaning one thing, light steps meaning something safer. Here's something that doesn't show up if you're only watching from a distance. A home like this isn't loud all the time. That's the part people get wrong when they imagine it. Most of the time, it's quiet, carefully, deliberately quiet. The quiet of people choosing their words the way you choose your footing crossing a frozen river. The loud moments are rare enough that everyone remembers them precisely, but the quiet in between is its own kind of exhausting because it's never restful. It's vigilance dressed up as peace. Night. His wife learned never to speak first when he came home, short-tempered from a bad trade or a slow servant or a neighbor who'd looked at him the wrong way. She learned to let him speak first, always, so she could shape her response to whatever mood had walked in the door with him. His servants learned the same lesson faster than his wife had because they had less invested in staying. More than one left within a season, and Bharadvaja told himself each time that they simply weren't suited to hard work, never once wondering whether the work was hard or whether he was. One young servant, a boy of perhaps 14 sent to work in the household by a family that needed the wages, lasted only a few months before his father came to collect him personally, apologizing for the inconvenience but explaining plainly that the boy had stopped sleeping properly, startling awake at small sounds in a way he'd never done before he came to this particular house. Bharadvaja, hearing this secondhand from his wife, was genuinely baffled by it. He had never once raised a hand to the boy, had paid him fairly, had not, in his own accounting, done anything that should produce this kind of fear in a healthy child. What he didn't account for, and likely never would, was that a boy doesn't need to be struck to learn that a room can turn dangerous without warning. He only needs to watch it happen enough times to other people, or to himself in smaller ways, not to build the same wary alertness a much older person might build after years of the same lesson. But it gets stranger the closer you look. Because Bharadvaja in his own mind was not the source of the tension in his household. He believed with total sincerity that he was simply a man surrounded by people who were careless, who tested his patience, who gave him no choice but to respond the way he did. If you asked him directly whether his temper frightened the people who loved him, he would have been genuinely confused by the question. He didn't see fear in their careful silences. He saw respect. He had trained himself, now slowly and without noticing, to read the symptoms of his own anger as evidence of his own authority. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the hinge that so much of this story turns on, again and again, different lives. The people who frighten the rooms they walk into are very often the last to know it. Anger has a way of narrating itself as righteousness from the inside, and even while everyone outside it is simply trying to get through the day without setting it off. There's an old verse, part of a chapter the early Buddhist tradition devoted entirely to anger, called the Koda Vaga, a chapter on wrath. That pictures anger as a chariot, not a chariot charging gloriously into battle. A chariot whose wheel has come loose, careening wherever the road happens to tilt it, looking like motion, looking even like power, but going nowhere its rider actually intended. The verse says that the one who can hold that chariot steady, who can catch the wheel before it flies off entirely, is the only one who could rightly be called a charioteer at all. Everyone else is just along for whatever ride their fire decides to take them on. Bharadvaja had never heard this verse. If he had, he likely would have dismissed it as something monks said to people too weak to hold their ground. He believed, as so many people believe, in every century, in every household where anger runs the show, that holding the wheel steady would have meant giving something up, being weaker, being walked over. Pay attention to this, and because it's the quiet tragedy underneath everything that's coming. He thought his anger protected him from being controlled. What it actually did was put the wheel in anger's hands instead of his own. One evening, this is a small moment, almost too small to mention, except that small moments are where you can see a person most clearly. Bharadvaja came home to find that a meal had been prepared late. Nothing dramatic. A delay of perhaps half an hour, caused by nothing more sinister than a fire that hadn't caught quickly in damp wood. His wife heard him come through the gate and felt her whole body brace, the way you might brace before a step you know is going to be slippery. He didn't shout that night. That's the detail worth noticing. And he simply went quiet in the particular way that frightened her more than shouting would have. A silence with weight in it, a silence that made the rest of the evening unfold around his mood like furniture arranged around a fire no one wanted to acknowledge was burning. His wife served the late meal without a word. His children, sensing the air, ate quickly and asked to be excused early. No one said anything was wrong. Everyone behaved as though the evening were perfectly ordinary. This is the part that's easy to misread. If you've never lived inside a house like this, nothing happened. No one was struck. No one was screamed at. And yet everyone in that house spent the evening managing a man's mood the way you'd manage a fire that hadn't gone out. Never directly, always carefully, always with one eye on whether it might flare. Here's where it gets remarkable. In a quiet and uncomfortable way, this is anger too. Not the version that breaks jars or shoves boys into rivers, the slower version. The version that simply changes the temperature of a room and asks everyone in it to reorganize their evening around not setting it off. If you've ever lived with someone like this, or if you've ever been the person whose silence reorganized a room, you already know there's a whole category of anger that never raises its voice at all, and it can cost a household just as much as the kind that does. There's a Pali word for the verbal cruelty that does eventually escape Bharadvaja's mouth in moments when something finally pushes past even his cold silence. Akosa, abuse, insult, the words a person throws when they've decided someone deserves to be hurt by language. You'll hear this word again, much later in the very last part of this story, in a grove far from this house, when an old man finally says everything he has never quite said out loud before. For now, Just notice that the word exists, that there's an entire vocabulary in this tradition for the specific damage that words alone can do. And his children grew up fluent in a language that had no formal name, but that every member of the household understood perfectly. The language of footsteps, of door latches, of how a clay cup was set down on a table. A cup set down gently meant the evening would likely pass without incident. A cup set down with even slightly more force than necessary meant something had gone wrong somewhere in his day. The household should brace accordingly. His eldest son became, without ever being taught to, a kind of household weather reader, arriving home from his own work each evening and pausing just inside the gate, listening, before deciding whether it was safe to greet his father directly, or better to simply slip past toward his own room and wait for the air to settle. This is its own kind of inheritance, separate from anything Bharadvaja ever intended to pass down. He never sat his children down and told them to be afraid of him, never once thought of himself as someone his own children needed strategies to survive. But strategies were exactly what they built, the way children always build strategies around whatever weather their household actually produces, regardless of what that weather believes about itself. His daughter learned to ask her mother for things rather than her father, even when the request had nothing to do with him, simply because the asking felt safer routed through someone whose mood she could predict. His son learned to agree quickly and completely with whatever opinion his father expressed at the table, even opinions he privately disagreed with, because disagreement, however mild, however reasonable, had a way of growing teeth in that particular room. You may recognize something of this in your own life, even if the household you grew up in or the household you've built looks nothing like Bharadvaja's on the surface. Almost everyone has learned at some point to read a particular person's mood before deciding how to approach them. A boss, a parent, a partner, sometimes even a friend. It's such a common skill that it barely registers as a skill at all. But it's worth asking every now and then what that skill is actually protecting you from, and what it might be costing the relationship to need it in the first place. And here's the part that still surprises people who haven't thought much about anger before. Krodha, the broader word for anger itself, is never treated by these old teachers as something to be ashamed of feeling. The shame, if there was any, was never in the spark. It was in what a person did once the spark caught, whether they fed it, defended it, built a whole identity around it, the way Bharadvaja was quietly doing, one quiet evening at a time, without ever noticing the architecture going up around him. His wife went to bed that night having said almost nothing all evening. In the dark, lying beside a man who had not raised his voice once, she found herself wondering, not for the first time, not for the last, what exactly she was protecting her children from, and whether protecting them from it was even possible in a house built around someone else's weather. The next morning arrived ordinary, the way mornings after evenings like that one always did in this household. No acknowledgement of what had passed, no discussion, simply a fresh day laid carefully over the top of an unresolved one, the way a thin coat of paint gets laid over a crack rather than fixing whatever caused it. Bharadvaja greeted his wife and children with perfectly reasonable warmth, having apparently filed the previous evening away as nothing worth revisiting, while she and the children carried it quietly into the new day, the way you carry the memory of weather even once the sky itself has cleared. Let that sit with you for a moment, because we're going to need it. Has anger ever made you say something, or say nothing at all, that you couldn't quite take back? It's worth being honest with yourself about which kind of anger you've lived closest to. You remember the boy he pushed into the river all those years ago? The one who went under in water higher and faster than it looked from the bank. It's time you learned what became of him. He survived. And a fisherman pulled him out a quarter-mile downstream, half drowned, coughing up water for an hour afterward, but alive. His family never confronted Bharadvaja's family about it. They were poorer, and poorer families in that village learned early which doors you knocked on and which ones you simply walked past, the way you'd walk past a dog you knew would bite. The boy grew up carrying a scar on his forehead from where he'd struck a rock going under, and something else besides the scar, a flinch, faint but permanent, whenever he found himself near deep water, or near anyone who reminded him even slightly of the feeling of being shoved by someone bigger than him who felt entitled to do it. Years passed. The boy became a young man, then a grown one, with a trade of his own. A seller of cloth, modest but steady, the kind of life built one careful transaction at a time. And one ordinary afternoon, the same marketplace where so many ordinary afternoons had already passed without incident, he found himself standing across a table from a Brahmin haggling over a length of dyed cotton, loudly, the way this particular Brahmin haggled over everything. It was Bharadvaja. Older now, heavier in the face, but unmistakably the same man, the same impatience in his hand, the same readiness to take offense at a price he found insulting, as though the cloth seller had personally set out to wrong him. There's a detail here easy to miss about old wounds. They don't always announce themselves. And the cloth seller didn't recognize Bharadvaja's face right away. It had been too many years, too much had changed in both of them. What he recognized was something underneath the face, a particular quality of impatience, a specific way of leaning forward when annoyed, as if the whole body wanted to close the distance and intimidate rather than simply argue. Something in his stomach tightened before his mind had caught up to why. And Bharadvaja raised his voice over the price of the cotton, not because the price was unreasonable, but because raising his voice was simply how he negotiated everything, how he had negotiated his whole life. And for just a moment, the cloth seller's hand went still on the fabric, and an old half-buried memory surfaced without permission. Cold water closing over his head, the current pulling him sideways, a sound of laughter fading above the surface as he went under. He said nothing about it. He simply lowered his price more than the argument warranted and watched the Brahmin walk away satisfied, having won, as he always won, an argument he didn't know he'd already won decades earlier in a much more permanent way on the bank of a river. Notice what just happened in that small, unremarkable transaction. Bharadvaja walked away believing he'd gotten the better of a stubborn merchant. He had no idea he'd just stood, for the second time in 2 lives, across from someone whose fear of him predated their meeting that day. This is something worth sitting with. How much of the deference anger receives in a lifetime is never about the moment it's happening in at all. It's about every moment before it that taught someone caution. Bharadvaja would have called this winning if anyone had asked him to name what just happened. A more honest name for it might simply have been old fear, dressed up as a stranger's good manners, a debt being quietly repaid by someone who never knew consciously that he owed it, or to whom, or for what. A cloth seller went home that evening and told his own wife about the encounter. The way people often recount small, strange disturbances at the end of an ordinary day. He didn't tell her about the river. He had never told her about the river. In all their years of marriage, finding the memory too small and too humiliating to seem worth mentioning, a child's misfortune rather than a real story. He simply told her that a particular Brahmin had haggled him down further than he should have allowed, and that something about the man's manner had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. His wife, not practical about these things, told him not to think too hard about it, that difficult customers were simply part of the trade, and he agreed with her out loud while privately carrying, for the rest of that evening and several after it, the strange sensation of having been frightened by someone for reasons that predated any memory he could consciously locate. It's worth pausing on how ordinary this kind of unnamed fear actually is, scattered quietly through almost everyone's life in smaller forms than a near drowning, a tone of voice that reminds you of someone you'd rather not think about, a particular kind of impatience that makes your shoulders tighten before your mind has caught up to why. Most people carry a handful of these unexamined flinches without ever tracing them back to their source, simply rerouting around whatever triggers them and calling the rerouting common sense. And it's often something closer to an old wound, quietly still steering the present from somewhere just out of view. None of this is offered as an argument that every flinch deserves a full excavation, or that every old wound needs to be dug up and examined before a person can move forward with their life. Most days, simply noticing the flinch is enough. A small moment of recognition that says, in effect, there's that old current again, without needing to follow it all the way back to the riverbank it first came from. The cloth seller never traced his discomfort back to a half-remembered shove on a riverbank decades earlier. None. He didn't need to live a perfectly full and ordinary life. But Bharadvaja's story, the one this whole telling has been following, suggests that some currents run strong enough and get fed often enough that eventually they do demand to be traced. Not for everyone and not always, but for a fire allowed to burn unexamined for 7 decades. The tracing eventually becomes less optional than it might have been at 20 or 30 or even 50. The longer a current runs unexamined, the more of a life it quietly gets to steer. There's a teaching that circulated even in Bharadvaja's own time, carried by wandering monks through marketplaces just like this one. Though Bharadvaja had never once stopped to listen to it. It said simply that hatred is never settled by hatred in this world, that the only thing that ever settles it is its opposite, non-hatred. None. Some translations render it as love, though that word can sound soft in a way the original doesn't quite intend. It isn't soft, it's the much harder discipline of refusing to add your own fire to a fire that's already burning. Now, Bharadvaja had heard fragments of this kind of teaching before. The way you hear things you're not ready to listen to, present in the room, technically audible, but sliding past without finding purchase. Monk had once passed through his village teaching about Kanti patience and about metta, a loving kindness extended even toward people who had wronged you. Bharadvaja had scoffed loudly in front of his own household. "No, what kind of strength is that?" he'd said. "That lets people walk over you and calls it virtue. Here's the part that's easy to misread if you've never sat with it long enough." Bharadvaja wasn't wrong that there's a kind of weakness that looks like patience and isn't. The kind that comes from fear rather than choice, that simply absorbs harm because it doesn't know how to do anything else. But he had never once considered that there might be a different kind entirely. A patience that comes not from an inability to fight, but from having looked closely enough at fighting to see what it actually costs the person doing it. You might be wondering by now whether anyone in this story ever tried to reach him, to tell him plainly what his anger looked like from the outside. The answer is complicated, and we're going to spend a great deal of this story finding out. But here's something worth carrying forward as we move ahead. The people closest to him had long since stopped trying, not because they didn't care, because every attempt had been met with the same wall of certainty that he was the wronged party, always in every single encounter, and across an entire lifetime of encounters that statistically could not all have wronged him equally. There had been attempts early on. His own mother, before she died, had once tried, gently, the way mothers often try first, hoping gentleness alone might be enough, to suggest that perhaps not every merchant in the marketplace was actually trying to cheat him, that perhaps some of the anger he carried home each evening belonged to something other than the specific transaction he blamed it on. He had not shouted at her. He simply looked at her with an expression of such genuine confusion, such complete inability to locate what she might be talking about, that she never raised the subject again. It wasn't that he punished her for trying. It was that the attempt simply failed to land anywhere, the way water fails to soak into stone that's already been baked hard by years of sun. His wife had tried once too, early in their marriage, in a quieter way. Not a direct accusation, just a question asked carefully about whether he ever noticed how quickly people seemed to agree with him. He had taken this at the time as a compliment about his persuasiveness and thanked her for noticing, and she had never found the right moment to clarify what she'd actually meant. The moment for clarifying things like this rarely announces itself clearly. It passes the way most moments do. By the time you realize you've let it pass, a new one hasn't yet arrived to take its place. His daughter, by far the boldest of his children in this particular regard, made her own attempt when she was nearly grown, old enough to have started noticing the shape of her own marriage prospects and wondering, with the particular clarity young women sometimes have about households other than their own, and whether she wanted to repeat the pattern she'd grown up inside. She asked him directly, one evening when his mood happened to be lighter than usual, whether he ever worried that people agreed with him out of fear rather than respect. He laughed, not unkindly, and told her that fear and respect were closer cousins than she realized, that a man who couldn't inspire a little fear in the people around him would never accomplish anything worth accomplishing. She didn't push further. She had asked the question she'd been carrying for months, gotten an answer that closed the conversation rather than opening it, and learned, the way her mother had learned before her, that some doors in this particular house simply didn't open from the outside, no matter how carefully you knocked. This is, if you think about it carefully, one of the strangest and most common features of anger as it actually lives in human beings, rather than how we imagine it in villains and stories. It rarely announces itself as a flaw to the person carrying it. It announces itself every single time as proof that the world has been unfair, and that this time, this specific time, the anger is finally completely justified. Keep that in mind. We're going to need it, because somewhere far from this marketplace, in a grove that doesn't yet have a name that matters to Bharadvaja, a teaching is spreading quietly among people who have started to ask a very different question about anger. Not whether it's justified, but what it actually does to the person who holds it, justified or not. Bharadvaja hasn't heard this teaching yet. He has decades left before he will. But you've probably already felt the shape of this question yourself, somewhere in your own life, a moment when you were completely, totally certain you were right to be furious. And a much later moment, looking back, where the certainty looked a little different. Maybe it still felt justified, but maybe it also cost you something you didn't notice costing you at the time. That's the question this whole story is going to keep circling, chapter after chapter, life after life. Not whether anger is ever justified. Almost everyone who has ever been angry has felt justified. The question is what it costs, and who actually pays that cost, both in the moment and for a very long time afterward. Think for a moment about the last time you watched someone, maybe a parent, maybe your own reflection in a difficult moment, bite back words they desperately wanted to say to a child who'd done something small and forgivable. The flash of heat, the decision made in less than a second about whether to let it out or hold it. Almost everyone alive has stood at that exact fork in the road more than once. Almost no one talks about how hard that fork actually is to navigate every single time, no matter how many times you've stood at it before. It doesn't get easier with practice, exactly. It gets more familiar. And familiarity, it turns out, is not nothing. It's where this story is quietly headed, toward what it might mean to recognize that fork early enough to choose differently, even after a lifetime of choosing the same way. He has spent his whole life believing the world keeps giving him reasons to be furious. Here is the first man who refused to give him one. By the time Bharadvaja reached middle age, his reputation in the wider trading circles around Savatthi had settled into something fixed. People knew him, the way you know a stretch of road that floods every rainy season. You didn't need to have been caught in the flood yourself to plan your route around it. Merchants who dealt with him built extra patience into every transaction, The way you'd build extra time into a journey you knew would hit delays. One of those merchants was a man named Anathapindika, wealthy, respected, generous to the point that people sometimes mistook his generosity for naivety, which it was not. He had built his fortune carefully, and he would later spend a considerable portion of it building a monastery grove for a teacher he hadn't even met yet, simply because the idea of that teacher's presence felt, to him, worth more than the gold it cost. But that part of his story comes later. For now, you only need to know that Anathapindika and Bharadvaja did business together occasionally, the way two prominent men in the same trading circles inevitably do, whether they like each other or not. Before we get to that particular dispute over grain, there's a smaller story worth telling first, and because it shows something about loyalty that the rest of this chapter is going to need. There was a charioteer named Channa who had served a different household entirely, not Bharadvaja's, not Anathapindika's, but a neighboring family whose patriarch shared more than a little of Bharadvaja's temperament. Channa had driven that man's chariot for over 20 years, through every mood the man had ever produced, absorbing insults meant for slower traffic, for muddy roads, for horses that occasionally spooked at nothing in particular. He had never once raised his own voice in response, not because he lacked the standing to. By this point in his service, he was trusted with the household's finances as much as its horses, but because he had decided early in his service that his own dignity didn't depend on his employer's mood, however loudly that mood occasionally announced itself. One particular afternoon, Bharadvaja happened to witness an exchange between Channa and his employer at a crossroads where both men's chariots had become briefly tangled in a dispute over right-of-way. The patriarch shouted at Channa for the delay, blaming him entirely for a problem that was, by any reasonable account, simply the unavoidable result of two narrow roads meeting at an inconvenient hour. Channa said nothing in his own defense. He simply backed the chariot clear, apologized for the inconvenience to the other travelers regardless of whose fault it actually was, and continued on, his employer still muttering beside him. Bharadvaja, watching this from his own chariot, now felt something close to contempt for the charioteer in that moment. The particular contempt he reserved for anyone who absorbed an insult without returning it, which he had always read as weakness rather than as anything resembling strength. It would be years before he encountered, in a grove far from that crossroads, an argument for why a man like Channa might have been doing something considerably harder and considerably wiser than fighting back. For now, he simply filed the charioteer away as one more example of a world full of people too soft to stand up for themselves, never once wondering why a man that soft had kept his composure across 20 years of service while Bharadvaja himself had managed by this point in his life to alienate nearly every household he'd ever done business with. And Channa's own employer, in fairness, came to a quieter understanding of this much later in his life, in his final illness, when it was Channa rather than any of his own children who sat with him through the worst of his nights, having simply outlasted, through 2 decades of steady, undramatic service, every reason the old man might once have had to dismiss him. He told Channa near the end that he was sorry for every harsh word across all those years, and Channa, true to the pattern of his entire service, told him there was nothing to apologize for, and meant it, not because the harsh words hadn't landed, but because he had long since decided that carrying them forward would have cost him more than absorbing them ever had. It was, in the end, the old man rather than the charioteer who needed forgiveness most, and the old man rather than the charioteer who received it most freely, offered without conditions by the one person who had every reason, after 20 years, to withhold it entirely. One particular exchange went badly. A shipment of grain arrived later than promised, due to weather neither man controlled, and Bharadvaja responded the way he responded to every inconvenience, loudly, publicly, in front of enough witnesses to make the humiliation sting. He accused Anathapindika of deliberate dishonesty. He used words designed to wound rather than simply to negotiate. A crowd gathered the way crowds gather whenever someone raises their voice in a marketplace, drawn by the same instinct that slows traffic past an accident. Here's what most people miss about moments like this. Now, everyone in that crowd expected the same outcome. They expected Anathapindika to either match the volume, shout back, defend his honor the way men in his position were supposed to, or to back down entirely, apologize, smooth things over the way most people did when Bharadvaja's temper turned toward them. He did neither. Anathapindika simply waited until Bharadvaja had finished. And Bharadvaja, when no one interrupts him, tends to go on for some time, and then said quietly that the grain would arrive when the weather allowed it to arrive, that he was sorry for the inconvenience this caused, that he hoped Bharadvaja's family wasn't suffering for the delay. No raised voice, no apology beyond what was actually his to apologize for. No retreat either. He didn't grovel, none. Didn't offer Bharadvaja anything beyond what was true and fair. The crowd, expecting a spectacle, got something far stranger. Nothing at all. The argument simply had nowhere to go, because only one side of it was actually arguing. And a few of the onlookers, by accounts that circulated afterward in the marketplace gossip that followed any public confrontation involving Bharadvaja, found themselves almost disappointed by the lack of escalation, the way an audience can feel cheated by a performance that refuses to deliver the climax it seemed to be building toward. Others, a smaller number, found themselves unexpectedly moved on, recognizing in Anathapindika's calm something they hadn't quite seen modeled in public before. Not weakness, not capitulation, but a kind of strength that didn't need an audience's approval to sustain itself. One merchant who witnessed the exchange later mentioned it to his own son for years afterward as an example of how a man could hold his ground without needing to raise his voice to prove he was holding it. And this is where it gets remarkable, because here's the part that's easy to misread if you've never stood in a room like that one. Anathapindika's calm wasn't weakness, and it wasn't even, primarily, generosity. And it was something closer to refusal. A refusal to let someone else's fire decide what kind of person he was going to be in that moment. He had clearly decided long before this particular shipment of grain what kind of man he intended to be when provoked, and he simply stayed that man, regardless of how loudly Bharadvaja insisted the situation called for something else. And Bharadvaja walked away from that encounter unsatisfied in a way he couldn't quite name. He had won the argument. Technically, Anathapindika had apologized after all, hadn't he? And yet something about the whole exchange sat wrong in his chest for days afterward, the way a meal sits wrong when something in it was slightly off, even if you can't say exactly what. There was a second encounter between the two men some months later that made the pattern even harder for Bharadvaja to dismiss. A separate dispute, this one genuinely Anathapindika's fault. A miscount in a shipment of dyed wool that cost Bharadvaja a small but real sum. This time Bharadvaja arrived at Anathapindika's home directly, prepared for a longer fight, having rehearsed on the walk over several different opening lines, each one sharper than the last. Anathapindika met him at the gate himself, rather than sending a servant, which Bharadvaja noted with some satisfaction, reading it as a sign that his reputation alone was enough to summon the man's personal attention. Before Bharadvaja could begin, Anathapindika told him plainly that he already knew about the miscount, had already arranged to make up the difference, and was sorry it had taken until Bharadvaja's visit for him to say so directly, rather than sending word through an intermediary the way he probably should have from the start. There was again nothing to push against. Bharadvaja stood in the doorway holding sentences he no longer had anywhere to put, the way you might arrive somewhere holding a heavy basket only to find there's no table left to set it down on. He left that meeting having gotten exactly what he came for, the wool or its value restored in full, and somehow felt more unsettled walking home than he had after the first encounter, the one where he'd actually had to fight for the apology. You may have noticed, and if you've ever dealt with someone like Anathapindika yourself, that there's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from being met with total reasonableness when you arrived prepared for a battle. It isn't satisfying the way winning a fight is satisfying. It leaves you holding all your own momentum with nowhere left to spend it, and that unspent momentum doesn't simply evaporate. It tends to look for somewhere else to go on. You may have had an experience like this yourself, an argument you technically won, that still left you feeling worse than losing might have. There's a reason for that feeling, and it has very little to do with who said what. It has to do with what you were actually trying to get from the argument in the first place and whether winning the words ever actually got you that thing. There's an old story, older even than Bharadvaja's lifetime, passed down among storytellers long before it found its way into the Jataka collections, about a Brahmin who learned a spell from a dying teacher that could summon great wealth, but only if used with a pure heart. Vedaba was his name in some tellings. He used the spell once for good, lifting himself and a traveling companion out of poverty, and then greed crept in slowly, the way it always does. Not as a single decision, but as 1,000 small ones, each one feeling reasonable in isolation. He used the spell again and again, each time wanting slightly more than the time before, until the wanting itself became a kind of fever, and the fever led him into the hands of bandits who killed him for what he'd already accumulated, never once recognizing that the danger had been growing inside himself long before it arrived from outside. It's a story about greed more than anger on its surface, but notice the shape underneath it, because it's the same shape Bharadvaja's life keeps tracing. A small thing indulged once that doesn't stay small. A first shove that becomes a habit of shoving. And a first shout that becomes a household organized entirely around the next shout. The mind does not naturally cap its own appetites, whether the appetite is for gold or for the particular satisfaction of being right, loudly, at someone else's expense. Left alone, both tend to grow. There's a word for the steady, more contemplative quality Anathapindika seemed to be drawing on that day in the marketplace. Upekkha, equanimity, not coldness, not indifference, something closer to a kind of balance that doesn't tip over just because someone else has decided to push against it. And underneath that balance sits another word, one that comes up again and again in the old teachings whenever anger is being discussed. Dukkha, the subtle, grinding unsatisfactoriness that runs underneath even our happiest, most certain moments, including, perhaps especially, the moment of feeling completely justified in your own fury. Centuries after this story takes place, a king named Ashoka, who had conquered with a brutality history would remember for a very long time, would have his own confrontation with this same question on a far larger scale. The war that finally broke something open in him was fought against a kingdom called Kalinga, a campaign he pursued with the same confidence in his own cause that had carried every previous campaign of his reign. The victory, when it came, was total. The cost, recorded later in his own words, was staggering enough that even a king accustomed to the arithmetic of conquest found himself unable to look away from it. Not tens of thousands killed in the fighting itself, and many more carried off or displaced in the war's aftermath, numbers large enough that they stopped functioning, even for him, as the kind of abstract tally a victorious general usually allows himself to file away and move past. After a war that left so many dead he could no longer pretend the cost was worth the gain, he had his reflections carved into rock, scattered across his empire, so that anyone who could read would know what he'd come to understand too late for the dead to benefit from it. In one of those edicts, the 13th, he wrote that the only true conquest worth pursuing was conquest by Dhamma, by truth, by virtue, not by the sword. A man who had once believed force could settle anything had come, eventually, to a very different conclusion. It cost him an empire's worth of grief to get there. Bharadvaja was no king, and his battles were smaller. A marketplace, a household, a string of merchants who'd learned to dread doing business with him. But the same lesson sat waiting for him, unclaimed, decade after decade. The question was never whether he could win these small confrontations. He almost always could, the way Ashoka could almost always win on a battlefield. The question, the one nobody around him seemed able to make him hear, was what winning was actually costing him every single time he reached for it. Have you ever met someone whose calm made you angrier in the moment, only to think about it later and wonder if their calm was actually the stronger position the whole time? I'd love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. If you think his anger is extreme, you haven't yet met the man whose anger became a weapon of murder. This next part of the story steps away from Bharadvaja for a while, not because he's no longer important, but because his story makes far more sense once you've seen how far the same fire can travel in a different life, when nothing and no one stops it early enough. There was once a young man, gifted, intelligent, beloved by his teacher above all the other students in his school. His name, before everything changed, was Ahimsaka, which means, with a cruelty that only becomes clear later, the harmless one. He had been given that name by parents who wanted more than anything a gentle son, and for a long time he was exactly that. Quick to learn, quick to please, the kind of student a teacher points to as proof that effort and devotion are rewarded. But the other students grew jealous of him. Jealousy, left to sit long enough in a person's chest, has a way of curdling into something that looks for an exit, and the exit these students found was simple. They poisoned their teacher's mind against Ahimsaka, one fabricated complaint at a time, and until the teacher, a man who should have known better, who should have trusted decades of evidence over a handful of whispered lies, came to believe his best student was secretly plotting against him. The teacher devised a punishment so severe, it's hard to imagine he expected it to be survivable, let alone obeyed. He told Ahimsaka that to complete his training, to earn the knowledge he'd spent years pursuing, he would need to bring his teacher 1,000 human fingers, each taken from a different person. Here's the part nobody warns you about. When betrayal arrives wearing the costume of authority, Ahimsaka believed him, and he had spent his whole life trusting this man completely, and that trust didn't simply switch off the moment the request became monstrous. Something in him, call it devotion twisted past its breaking point, call it the desperate need to prove a loyalty that had just been falsely accused, agreed to the task, and so the harmless one became something else. He took to the forest roads and he began collecting fingers from travelers, and somewhere in the killing, because you cannot take 1,000 fingers without ending a great many lives to get them. Something in him that might have flinched at the first death stopped flinching at all. By the time he had killed enough people that travelers refused the roads near his territory entirely, villages emptied along his route, and the man people now called Angulimala, garland of fingers, and for the grim necklace he wore from his collection, had become a name parents used to frighten children into obedience. Among the travelers who never returned from that road was a potter named Sona, a husband and father of 3, had set it out one morning with a small cart of finished pottery to sell in a neighboring town, the kind of routine trip he had made dozens of times before without incident. His wife waited for him that evening, and the next, and the one after that, before a neighbor finally found the overturned cart, the pottery scattered and broken across the road. No sign of the potter himself beyond what the soil and the silence suggested. She never had a body to bury, never had a clear account of what exactly had happened to him, only the slow, terrible understanding that settled over the whole region as more carts turned up overturned, and more families waited for husbands and sons who simply never came home. Pay attention to this, because it's the question this story keeps circling from every direction. How does a harmless boy become a man who kills strangers on a forest road without hesitation? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't comforting. But it isn't a mystery either. It happens the way most terrible things happen, gradually, then suddenly. A first death that felt impossible, then survivable, then almost routine. Each one making the next one slightly easier. The way each unanswered shout in Bharadvaja's house made the next shout slightly more natural, slightly more automatic, slightly less like a choice and more like simply who he was. And the forest road Angulimala chose for his hunting ground ran through dense country, the kind where travelers moved in groups when they could afford to, precisely because solitary figures had started disappearing along that stretch with unsettling regularity. Merchants rerouted entire trade caravans to avoid it, adding days to journeys, accepting the cost as simply the price of staying alive. Mothers in nearby villages used his name the way mothers everywhere use the name of whatever frightens them most. Keep children from wandering too far from home after dark. What's worth sitting with in all of this is how completely the killing had stopped requiring any justification by the time it had been going on for years. In the earliest days, by some accounts, he had still rehearsed the original reason to himself before each act, his teacher's command, the 1,000 fingers, the training he was owed. But reasons like that have a way of becoming unnecessary scaffolding once a habit has fully taken hold. The scaffolding falls away, and what's left standing is simply the habit itself, requiring no more justification than breathing does. He had become, by the time the Buddha entered that forest, someone for whom killing strangers was no longer a means toward anything. It had become the entire shape of his days. This is worth sitting with for exactly the reason it's uncomfortable to sit with. It suggests that the distance between an ordinary person and a person capable of this is not the wide, reassuring gulf most people assume it to be. It's a long series of small, individually survivable steps, each one slightly easier than the last precisely because the one before it was survived. Nobody wakes up one morning a murderer. They arrive there one normalized cruelty at a time. The same road Bharadvaja was walking, far more slowly, one shout at a time, in a house many miles from any forest. And there's a word for the kind of shock that can break this pattern. When it finally arrives, samvega, the jolt that turns a person all at once toward the question of why their life has gone the way it has. Angulimala's samvega arrived in the strangest possible way. Word reached him that the Buddha himself had entered the forest alone, unarmed, walking the very road Angulimala used to hunt. And the murderer, who had killed without hesitation for longer than he could clearly remember, picked up his weapons and went after him. He chased the Buddha down that road and could not catch him. This detail matters more than it might seem to at first. Angulimala was, by every account, an extraordinarily capable man, fast and strong enough to run down travelers on foot for years. And yet, no matter how hard he ran, he could not close the distance to a man walking calmly ahead of him at an ordinary pace. He ran until his lungs burned, until sweat soaked through his robes, till the necklace of fingers he wore swung heavy and grotesque against his chest with every stride, a weight he had carried so long he'd nearly stopped feeling it as a weight at all, until this particular chase made every ounce of it suddenly, unbearably present again. He had never failed to close a distance like this before. Every other traveler on this road had eventually tired, stumbled, given him the gap he needed. This man did neither. He simply continued walking, unhurried, as though the forest itself were rearranging its distances specifically to keep him just out of reach, and the impossibility of it began to do something to Angulimala that no sermon could have done as quickly. It cracked. For the first time in years, his absolute confidence that he understood exactly what he was and exactly what he was capable of. Finally, exhausted, furious, lungs heaving, legs shaking with an effort that should have closed the distance a dozen times over and somehow hadn't. Angulimala called out for him to stop, and the Buddha answered, without turning, without slowing, that he had stopped. He told Angulimala that it was Angulimala who had not stopped at all, not running on the road, stopped in every sense that mattered, stopped harming on, stopped chasing whatever it was the killing had promised him and never once delivered. Here's something modern researchers only recently learned to describe with precision, though it applies just as well to what happened on that road. Something in those few words reached a place in Angulimala that 1,000 fingers worth of violence had never managed to fill and never could have. He stopped, not on the road, where he'd already physically halted, but somewhere much deeper, in the part of himself that had been running long before he ever took to that forest path. He set down his weapons. He asked to be taught. And the man who had spent years collecting fingers from strangers became, against every expectation anyone might reasonably have held, a monk. You might be wondering whether the people he'd hurt, the families of everyone he'd killed, ever had to face this transformation directly. Whether forgiveness, in a case this extreme, was even a question anyone could fairly ask. We're going to come back to that question very soon, because it doesn't resolve as simply as a clean conversion story might suggest. Hold on to it. For now, notice what this story is actually showing you. Underneath its horror, at the line between Bharadvaja's small, repeated cruelties and Angulimala's enormous ones is not a difference in kind. It's a difference in how far an unexamined fire was allowed to travel before something, anything, interrupted it. Bharadvaja never killed anyone, but the same mechanism that turned a betrayed, devoted student into a murderer is the same mechanism that turned a boy who broke a jar into a man whose entire household organized its evenings around his moods. Small permissions, repeated, becoming larger permissions, repeated, becoming an identity that feels, from the inside, less like a choice with each passing year and more like simply who a person is. This is the moment everything changes for anyone willing to look closely at it. If Angulimala, the worst version this story has to offer, a man who killed for years without apparent remorse, could stop, then the door was never actually closed for anyone less far gone. Not for Bharadvaja, not very possibly for you, in whatever smaller version of this pattern you might recognize in your own life. But stopping, as you're about to see, doesn't erase what came before it. It just opens the question of what happens next. To the person who stopped and to everyone still carrying what the stopping couldn't undo. You're still wondering what happened to the men whose families Angulimala destroyed. Stay with this, it's coming. Becoming a monk did not erase what Angulimala had done, and the tradition that preserved his story never pretended otherwise. He still had to walk among people, to beg for his food each morning, a way every monk did, bowl in hand, moving silently from door to door through villages and towns. And in those towns were people who recognized him. Some had lost a husband, a father, a brother to the man now standing quietly at their gate in saffron robes, asking for nothing more than whatever food they were willing to offer. One particular morning, while walking through a town for alms, stones began to fly, and not from strangers who'd simply heard rumors, from people who had buried someone because of him. A woman who had lost her husband on that forest road stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the monk who used to be her family's killer take a blow to the shoulder, then another to the side of his head, blood running into the saffron of his robe, and she did not throw anything. She simply watched, and she had buried her husband 3 years earlier in a grave she dug largely by herself because there had been no one else left in the family strong enough to help, her children too young, her husband's brothers living too far away to reach in time. She had raised those children alone since on a widow's narrow means in a town that was not unkind to her exactly, but that had its own grief to carry and only so much attention left over for hers. When word reached her that the murderer himself had been seen walking the road into town, wearing robes now, calling himself reformed, and something in her chest had gone cold and then almost immediately hot. a feeling she recognized because she had felt some version of it every single day since the burial, just usually with nowhere specific to aim at. She had walked to the edge of that crowd that morning already holding a stone in her hand, picked up from the road without entirely deciding to pick it up, the way your hand sometimes acts slightly ahead of your thinking. She had watched the first stones thrown by others land against his shoulder, his back, the side of his skull, and she had stood there with her own stone still in her closed fist, watching him take each blow, without flinching away from it, without raising a hand to protect himself, without doing anything at all except continuing to stand there, present, available to whatever was thrown. Her eldest child, now nearly grown, had come with her that morning, having heard the same rumors travel through the town and wanting, with a young person's hunger for resolution, to see the man responsible for his father's death finally face some consequence for it. He stood beside her, watching, and she felt him tense with each stone thrown by others, a tension she recognized because it matched something in her own chest, though hers had somehow, by the time it reached her hand, slowed down enough to hesitate where his showed no sign of hesitating at all. And here's what most people miss about a moment like this: there is no clean resolution available to her. Forgiveness, demanded too quickly, that can become its own kind of violence. A way of telling a grieving person that their grief is now inconvenient, now overdue for tidying away. And yet rage indulged too long can calcify into something that outlives even the person it was once aimed at, long after that person has changed beyond recognition. This is not forgiveness. This is not forgetting. This is not pretending the years of harm simply stopped existing because the man who caused them put on different robes. This is something smaller and harder to name. A woman finding in herself just enough room to stop adding to what was already there. She did not throw her stone. She stood there holding it until her hand ached from the holding, and then, when the crowd eventually thinned and the monk continued on his way down the road, she let it drop from her fingers onto the dirt and walked home without having decided anything as large as forgiveness, only that she did not, in the end, want to be the kind of person who added one more wound to a mourning that already had enough of them. She did not forgive him that day. The story doesn't claim she did. What she did instead was simply stop throwing anything, which is not forgiveness, but isn't nothing either. It's the first inch of room a person can sometimes find, even amid grief that has every right to refuse to move at all on. Angulimala took the stones in silence and did not run, did not defend himself, did not call out that he had changed, that he was sorry, that the man who'd done this was someone else now. And he simply absorbed what was thrown and kept walking, understanding, in a way that took him considerable time and considerable suffering to arrive at, that some debts cannot be settled by argument. They can only be lived through, slowly, in full view of the people still owed. He returned to that same town again in the following months, by some accounts, rather than avoiding it the way a more self-protective instinct might have counseled. He did not return to provoke another stoning, and he did not return expecting gratitude or recognition for having endured the first one without retaliation. Simply because avoiding the town entirely would have meant avoiding the people he had harmed, and some part of him, the part that had finally stopped running on that forest road, understood that avoidance was its own kind of unfinished business, a debt deferred rather than acknowledged. Some of the same people who had thrown stones the first time did not throw them again the second. Not because anything dramatic had been resolved between them, but because something in repeated, steady presence, not offered without defensiveness, eventually does what a single dramatic gesture rarely manages. It simply becomes harder to keep hating a fixed point that refuses to either fight back or disappear. Notice what just happened in that scene, because it's easy to rush past it looking for a tidier ending. Nobody was healed that morning. The widow's grief did not lift because the murderer took a beating. Angulimala's wounds did not undo a single death, and yet something had shifted regardless. Not resolution, but a kind of honesty that hadn't existed in that town before. The harm was named, in public, by the people who'd carried it. The man who'd caused it did not flinch away from being named. There's a teaching, much repeated in later centuries by a teacher named Pema Chodron, a Western nun working within a different but related Buddhist lineage, that names the specific hook anger uses to catch a person before they've even decided to be angry. She called it shenpa, a word borrowed from Tibetan, describing that instant tug, that almost physical pull, the moment right before a small irritation becomes a grip you can't easily loosen. The old Pal tradition has its own word for something close to this: upadana, clinging. The mind's habit of grabbing hold of a feeling and refusing, almost on instinct, to let it simply pass through. Chodron often illustrated the idea with an example drawn from ordinary domestic life rather than anything dramatic. Someone leaves a cabinet door open in the kitchen again after being asked repeatedly to close it, and the person who notices feels a small, sharp tug of irritation rise up, instantaneous, almost chemical in how quickly it arrives. The Shenpa, in her teaching, isn't the irritation itself, which is simply a passing reaction, gone within moments if left alone. The Shenpa is what happens a half-second later, when the mind grabs that irritation and starts building a story on top of it. They never listen to me. They don't respect my time. This always happens. This is just like everything else they do. Until a single open cabinet door has somehow become evidence in a case the mind has apparently been building for years. She taught her students to notice the moment of the grab itself, that specific half-second, because it was there, and really only there, that a person had any real choice about what happened next. Once the story had fully built itself, the anger that followed felt less like a choice and more like simple, justified arithmetic. Notice the shape of what's actually happening here. Watching Angulimala stand still while stones struck him, it might look like passivity, like simply absorbing harm because he no longer had the right to defend himself. But that's not quite what was happening. He had learned, at enormous cost, after enormous harm caused and enormous harm endured in return, to notice the Shenpa, the Upadana, the pull toward defending himself, toward explaining, toward turning the widow's grief back into another argument he might win. And he had learned, finally, to let that pull pass through him without grabbing hold of it. And what's actually happening here has very little to do with miracles and everything to do with biology that modern researchers have only recently learned to describe with precision. When a person feels threatened, insulted, provoked, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain, the amygdala fires almost instantly, faster than conscious thought, flooding the body with the readiness to fight or flee. This is not weakness, it's ancient survival machinery, the same machinery that once helped a smaller, more vulnerable version of our species survive actual predators. The trouble is that the machinery doesn't distinguish well between a tiger and a rude comment from a merchant. It treats both in the first instant as the same kind of emergency. What researchers studying this response have found again and again is that the chemical flood triggered by that first jolt, the cortisol, the adrenaline, tends to crest and begin subsiding within roughly 6 seconds if nothing feeds it further. 6 seconds. Not 6 minutes, not 6 hours of stewing afterward, just the first 6 seconds. If a person can find any way at all to simply let that initial wave pass without acting on it, without throwing the first stone or shouting the first insult. Angulimala, by the time he stood in that street being struck, had apparently learned something close to this. Not through any laboratory, but through years of forest solitude and a teacher willing to sit with a murderer until something in him finally settled. Bharadvaja, 4 chapters into this story, has learned nothing of the kind. He still meets every 6-second window the same way he met it as a 7-year-old boy standing over a broken jar, by reaching immediately and completely for the loudest available response. Have you ever managed to catch yourself in that 6-second window, felt the heat rise, and somehow let it pass without acting on it? It's harder than it sounds, and I'd genuinely like to know what worked for you, if anything has. Tell me below. There's one more thing worth carrying forward from this part of the story, something that becomes important again much later in a different shape entirely. The widow who watched Angulimala take those stones without retaliating did not leave that morning healed. But she also did not leave the same as she'd arrived. Something in watching a man fully receive the consequence of what he'd done, without excuse, without flinching, and without turning her grief into his opportunity to defend himself, gave her something rage alone had never managed to give her in all the years since her husband's death, the simple, unglamorous experience of being seen fully by the person who had taken something from her. In the years that followed, Angulimala became known, somewhat improbably given his history, as a teacher other young monks sought out specifically when they were struggling with violent or intrusive thoughts of their own. Not because he offered them easy comfort, but because he was among the entire community, uniquely incapable of pretending that such thoughts were rare or shameful or evidence of some unusual defect in the person having them. He had been, after all, the worst version of where such thoughts could lead, fully realized, not fully acted upon, and he had still found his way to something resembling peace afterward. Young monks who confessed to him their own fantasies of violence against people who had wronged them, expecting horror or rejection, and instead found someone who simply nodded, having understood the territory of that thought more thoroughly than almost anyone alive, and who could speak about it without flinching and without either condemning or excusing it. And one young monk in particular, tormented by an old grudge against a brother who'd cheated him out of an inheritance before he'd taken up the robe, came to Angulimala convinced that his own anger marked him as fundamentally unfit for the practice he'd committed his life to. Angulimala told him simply that he had once worn 1,000 fingers around his neck as proof of where unexamined anger could lead a person, and that the young monk's grudge, however bitter, was simply a smaller fire of the exact same kind, not categorically different, just less advanced along the same road. The comfort in this wasn't permission to stay angry. It was the relief of being told, by someone who could not possibly be exaggerating for effect, that the fire itself wasn't a unique mark of unworthiness. It was simply what unattended fire does in anyone, given enough time and enough fuel, and that the same path that had led him out of it remained open to anyone willing to walk it, however far gone they believed themselves to be. And few teachers in the entire tradition could have offered that particular reassurance with as much earned authority as the man who had once been the most feared name on that forest road. Other monks, gentler in their own histories, could only ever say that change was possible in theory. Angulimala simply was the proof standing in front of them, robed and breathing and teaching, decades after anyone who knew his name had stopped believing such a thing could happen to a man like him. That young monk, by later accounts, eventually did write to his brother, not to demand restitution for the inheritance, but simply to say that he no longer wished to carry the grudge into whatever years he had left, regardless of whether the brother ever acknowledged the original wrong, never received a reply. It didn't matter as much as he'd once assumed it would. The letter had done its work in the sending rather than in whatever response it might or might not produce, which was, in its own small way, the same lesson Angulimala himself had learned at far greater cost on a forest road decades earlier. He had spent years assuming the silence on the other end would feel unbearable. It turned out, instead, feel almost beside the point. There's something worth carrying forward from this small, almost incidental story before we return to the wider arc of Bharadvaja's life. Setting a grudge down has never any of the accounts this story has gathered so far required the other person's cooperation. Not Anathapindika's calm, not Visakha's patience, not this young monk's letter. And Every single instance of someone finding their way out of an old anger in this telling happened on terms that didn't depend on the other party agreeing to anything at all. That's either deeply discouraging or deeply freeing, and, depending on how you choose to look at it, discouraging if you've been waiting for an apology that may never come, freeing if you realize the waiting was never actually a requirement in the first place. And keep this moment in mind. We'll return to it in a different shape much later when an old Brahmin finally stands in front of someone who will not give his anger anywhere to land either. Anger doesn't only live in murderers and merchants. It sits just as easily on a throne. King Pasenadi ruled Kosala, one of the great kingdoms of the region, and by most accounts he was a thoughtful man, curious about the teaching spreading through his lands, willing to sit and ask difficult questions of the teacher who had become impossible to ignore in his kingdom. But thoughtfulness and temper are not opposites. A man can spend an afternoon in genuine philosophical conversation about the nature of suffering, and lose himself entirely an hour later over a servant who has, through no real fault of his own, simply gotten something wrong. This particular evening, Pasenadi had returned from a long day of administration, disputes settled, taxes reviewed, the endless grinding detail of holding a kingdom together, and he was tired in the specific way that makes small irritations feel enormous. A servant, new to the household, brought him the wrong dish entirely. Enough confusion in the kitchen that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with simple human error. The day itself had given him plenty of smaller frustrations to carry home, none of them large enough on their own to justify what almost happened that evening, but each one adding its own small weight to the pile. A border dispute between two landholders that he'd been asked to settle had dragged on for hours longer than it should have, both men too proud to accept a compromise that would have satisfied either of them perfectly well. And an advisor he trusted had contradicted him in front of two visiting dignitaries, technically correctly, which made the contradiction sting more rather than less. And underneath all of it sat the ordinary, grinding fatigue of a man who had spent the entire day making decisions other people would have to live with, none of whom seemed to fully appreciate how much that kind of deciding actually cost. And here's what most people miss about anger at the end of a long day. It isn't really about the dish. It's about everything that came before the dish all day that the king had no socially acceptable way to release. The dispute he'd lost, the advisor who'd contradicted him in front of others, the slow accumulation of 100 small frustrations with nowhere to go, until a servant walks in holding the wrong plate. Suddenly there's somewhere for all of it to go after all. Pasenadi rose from his seat, hand already lifting, the kind of motion that happens faster than thought, the body simply continuing a pattern it has practiced before, not in smaller versions on smaller provocations. The servant froze, the room froze, and then the king's wife, present in the room, watching, the way she had perhaps watched moments like this gather and threaten to break before, did nothing dramatic. She didn't cry out. She didn't physically intervene. She simply looked at him. You'd have to have been in that room to understand exactly what was in that look, and even then, words might fail to capture it precisely. It wasn't fear, though there may have been some of that underneath. It wasn't judgment, exactly, though it carried something close to it. It was something more like recognition, as if she were looking, in that frozen second, not at the king he was in that moment, but at the man she'd married, the man underneath the anger, and asking him, without a single word, whether this was who he actually wanted to be in front of a frightened servant who had brought him the wrong plate of food. Pay attention to this, because it's one of the most important moments in this entire story, even though almost nothing happens in it. His hand came down, not in violence, just down to his side, slowly, as the moment passed through him and out the other side, without becoming the thing it had been about to become. He didn't strike the servant. He didn't apologize loudly either, in the way that sometimes turns an apology into its own kind of performance. He simply sat back down, said nothing further about the dish, and let the evening continue. But here's the part that's easy to misread on. Watching only the surface of what happened, this wasn't really about willpower in the moment, though it might look that way from the outside. Willpower in the heat of a 6-second window like the one we talked about earlier is a thin and unreliable thing to depend on. What actually stopped Pasanati's hand wasn't a sudden burst of discipline. It was a relationship, years of being seen by someone who loved him enough to look at him exactly like that, at exactly the right moment, without saying a word that could have been argued with. You might be wondering what that look would have needed to actually contain, to work the way it worked. The honest answer is that it probably wasn't a single perfect look crafted for that exact moment. It was the residue of years, of a marriage in which she had presumably looked at him like that before in smaller moments, building a kind of shared language between them that didn't need words to do its work anymore. If you've ever been stopped mid-anger by a single glance from someone who knows you well enough not to need to explain what the glance means, you already understand something about what happened in that room that no amount of philosophy could have produced on its own. There's another woman in this same period whose calm under provocation became almost as well known as her wealth, Visa, a devoted laywoman who married into a family whose matriarch despised the new religion her daughter-in-law practiced. The mother-in-law looked for reasons to humiliate Visakha constantly, accused her, in front of others, of disrespect she hadn't shown, tried repeatedly to provoke a reaction that would justify sending her back to her own family in disgrace. One particular incident became something of a local legend in the household's later years. The mother-in-law accused Visakha, in front of a gathering of relatives, of secretly meeting with monks at night for reasons the older woman implied were improper rather than devotional. It was a serious accusation. The kind that could have permanently damaged a young wife standing in a household where reputation was nearly everything. Visakha did not raise her voice in response, not deny it with a kind of wounded indignation that might have looked, to onlookers, like guilt dressed up as outrage. She simply explained calmly and in detail exactly where she had been and why, invited witnesses who could confirm it, and continued the conversation as though nothing unusual had happened at all, neither punishing the accusation with anger nor flinching from it with the kind of overcorrected meekness that sometimes signals shame. And Visakha never matched the hostility, not because she lacked the standing to defend herself. She came from a family as wealthy and respected as the one she'd married into, but because she had decided deliberately what kind of daughter-in-law she intended to be regardless of provocation, the same way Anathapindika had decided in the marketplace what kind of merchant he intended to be regardless of Bharadvaja's shouting. Eventually, the mother-in-law's hostility wore itself out against a patience that simply never gave it anywhere to land, and the two women, against every expectation, became close. And here's the part that still puzzles scholars who study moments like this one. In both cases, the king's wife and Visakha, the thing that interrupted anger wasn't an argument won. It was a refusal to participate in the shape the moment seemed to be demanding. Anger, more than almost anything else, depends on a kind of agreement from everyone involved about what's supposed to happen next. And remove that agreement, and the anger has nowhere left to go but back into the person who's still holding it. The friendship that eventually grew between Visakha and her mother-in-law became, by some accounts, genuinely close in the older woman's final years. Close enough that the mother-in-law later credited Visakha's steady patience, rather than any argument or confrontation, with having shown her something about her own hostility that years of her own reflection had never managed to surface on its own. She had spent years testing a young woman she decided to dislike before ever truly meeting her, and what finally broke through wasn't a single dramatic reconciliation, but simply the accumulated weight of months and then years of provocation meeting nothing it could use. There's a Pali word for the deep, often unconscious tendencies that sit underneath moments like the king's near strike, anasaya, the latent inclinations a person carries long before any particular provocation calls them forward, nod. And there's another word for what happens once a small irritation is allowed to spin forward into elaborate self-justifying narrative, papancha. The mind's tendency to proliferate a single spark into an entire story about how wronged you've been, how justified your anger is, how much worse the offense was than it actually was in the first place. Bharadvaja, across this entire story, has been a master of papanga without ever knowing the word for it. Every small inconvenience expanding, in his mind, into proof of the world's cruelty toward him specifically. None. A traveler from a different world entirely passed through regions like this 1 century later, a Chinese pilgrim named Faxian, who journeyed for years recording what he found in Buddhist communities along his route. And among his observations were the careful systems monastic communities had built specifically to manage conflict between members, structured ways of airing grievances, of confessing faults, of ensuring that anger between people sharing a single roof had somewhere legitimate to go rather than curdling, unspoken, into resentment. Even communities devoted entirely to the teaching, Faxian noted, didn't pretend anger simply disappeared once a person took up the robe. They built structures to hold it because they knew better than to expect willpower alone to do the holding. Faxian recorded, in some detail, and a particular custom he observed in more than one monastery along his route. A fixed day, recurring regularly, set aside specifically for monks to voice grievances against one another openly in a structured setting, and rather than allowing those grievances to accumulate unspoken until they erupted or festered. He noted, with the careful attention of an outsider documenting an unfamiliar practice, that the monks did not treat the existence of grievances as a failure of their training, and they treated the failure to voice them as the actual danger, the quiet resentment that builds precisely because no proper channel exists for releasing it earlier, smaller, before it has time to calcify into something harder to address. A king's household, Pasanadi might have reflected had he ever read Faxian's account, had no such structure at all. A king's anger, like a king's any other private matter, was expected to simply manage itself in the privacy of his own discipline with no formal mechanism beyond a single, fortunate glance from someone who happened to love him enough to risk giving it. What does her face actually show him in that frozen second before his hand comes down? And we're going to circle back to this question soon. There's more in it than recognition alone. If a king's anger can be stopped by a glance, you might wonder why some anger never stops at all. And Devadatta was the Buddha's own cousin, raised in many of the same circles, ordained eventually into the same community of monks, gifted enough in his own right that he might have built a respected life entirely on his own terms. And for years, by most accounts, he did exactly that. He practiced diligently. He gained a degree of meditative skill that earned him real respect among the wider community. None of what came later erases that earlier sincerity, and the tradition that preserved his story never pretended otherwise. In those earlier years, by some accounts, Devadatta was genuinely admired by many of the younger monks for the precision of his discipline. He rose earlier than most, kept the monastic rules with a thoroughness that bordered on the severe, and could explain difficult points of practice with real clarity to students who found other senior monks harder to approach. He had, in other words, every visible marker of a man building exactly the kind of respected life the tradition holds up as worth pursuing. Several monks who knew him in this period later expressed genuine sorrow at what he eventually became, insisting that the man they'd trained alongside in those early years bore little resemblance in spirit to the figure his later choices made him into. This detail matters because it would be easy to imagine Devadatta as someone whose corruption was visible from the start, a villain in waiting. He wasn't. He was, for a long while, simply a talented and disciplined man, which makes what happened afterward considerably harder to dismiss as something that could only happen to lesser people. But somewhere along the way, sincerity curdled into something else. A hunger, specifically, to lead the community himself, to be recognized as the Buddha's equal or his successor, a hunger that grew quietly for years before it found its first real opening to act. And here's the part nobody tells you about resentment that's allowed to grow slowly, in private, without ever being named out loud. It doesn't usually announce itself as resentment, even to the person carrying it. Devadatta likely told himself, across those years, a perfectly reasonable story about his own ambitions, that the community needed stronger leadership, that he had earned a larger role through his own discipline and skill, that wanting more responsibility was simply a sign of dedication rather than a sign of anything uglier underneath it. He approached the Buddha directly, eventually, and asked to be given leadership of the community, suggesting that the Buddha, now older, might step back and let him take on a larger role. The Buddha refused, not unkindly, but plainly, saying he wouldn't hand leadership even to far more accomplished disciples than Devadatta, let alone to someone whose motives were this transparent, even to people far less perceptive than the Buddha himself. This is where the story turns, because rejection landing on top of years of quietly accumulated ambition didn't simply disappoint Devadatta. It detonated something. From that point forward on, several accounts describe a campaign of increasingly desperate attempts to undermine and eventually to physically harm the cousin who had refused him, and turning a king's son against his own father to seize a throne and gain a powerful ally, attempting to have boulders rolled down a hillside onto the Buddha as he walked below, even arranging for an elephant to be provoked into charging him in a public street. None of it succeeded. And here's the detail worth sitting with longer than the failed attempts themselves. Even after each failure, even after each plot collapsed and left him more exposed, more isolated, more obviously the architect of his own undoing, Devadatta never once seemed to consider simply stopping. The grudge had become, by this point, something closer to an organizing principle of his entire remaining life than a response to any specific ongoing offense. The elephant incident is worth lingering on a moment longer, because of a detail that often gets lost in the retelling. The animal Devadatta arranged to have provoked was known throughout the region for its size and its temper, and the street he chose was a narrow one, deliberately, so that anyone in the elephant's path would have nowhere to run. When the moment came, the crowd scattered in every direction, screaming, certain they were about to witness a death in the street. The Buddha did not run on. He stood where he was, and by most accounts simply extended toward the charging animal the same quality of calm attention he extended toward everything else that came at him. Bharadvaja's shouting, decades later included, though neither man knew it yet, and the elephant, inexplicably to the crowd watching, slowed, then stopped, then knelt. Devadatta, watching this fail like every other attempt before it, not conclude what most people might have concluded by this point, that perhaps the man he was trying so hard to destroy possessed some quality genuinely beyond his understanding, something worth approaching with curiosity rather than violence. He concluded, instead, that he simply hadn't tried hard enough yet, that the next plan would be the one that finally worked. This is, in its own way, one of the more chilling features of a grudge this advanced. It doesn't update on evidence the way a more flexible mind would. Every failure becomes, instead, a reason to escalate rather than a reason to reconsider. By the later years of his life, Devadatta had alienated nearly everyone who had once respected him, The disciples who had initially followed him out of the main community, persuaded by his arguments about needing stronger leadership, drifted back one by one once they saw up close what sustaining a grudge at this scale actually required of a person day after day. He ended his years with a smaller and smaller circle of people willing to remain near him, which seemed, to those watching from a distance, less like punishment and more like simple arithmetic. There is only so much company most people can stand to keep with someone whose every waking thought circles the same unhealed wound. Notice what's different here from everything you've watched so far in this story. Bharadvaja's anger, however corrosive, still responds to something. A jar, a delayed shipment, a slow servant. It flares and eventually subsides, even if it flares again at the next provocation. Angulimala's anger, however monstrous its expression, eventually met something, a teacher's calm words on a forest road that interrupted it entirely. Devadatta's anger, by contrast, seems to have become entirely self-sustaining. It no longer needed new provocations. It generated its own fuel indefinitely, long after any reasonable observer would have expected it to burn out from simple exhaustion. There's a word worth introducing here, sati, mindfulness. Not in the soft, decorative sense the word sometimes gets reduced to in casual conversation, but in its older, sharper sense, the capacity to notice what's actually happening in your own mind, clearly enough to interrupt a pattern before it runs all the way to its conclusion. And there's a companion word, vitaka, thought, specifically the kind of agitated, repetitive thought that circles a grievance over and over, sharpening it with each pass rather than letting it dull. Devadatta, for all his discipline in other areas, appears to have had remarkably little sati available to him once this particular vitaka took hold. He could meditate with real skill on other subjects, but on the specific subject of his cousin's refusal to hand him power, something in him had simply stopped being able to look clearly at what he was doing, or why, or what it was costing him with every failed attempt. Here's the part that's easy to misread if you're inclined to see this story as simply a portrait of villainy. Devadatta's tragedy isn't that he was uniquely evil among human beings. It's that he demonstrates, in an extreme and well-documented case, something far more ordinary than most people are comfortable admitting. That a grudge, left unexamined long enough, can eventually outgrow the person carrying it. It stops being a response to anything specific. It becomes instead a kind of permanent residence the person has built for themselves, one disappointment at a time, until there's no longer a version of them that exists outside it. You've probably known someone, maybe even been someone, for a stretch of time, who held on to a grievance long after the person who caused it had moved on, changed, or even forgotten the original offense entirely. The grudge holder is often the only one still living inside the original moment, replaying it, sharpening it, while the rest of the world has long since walked away from that particular afternoon. Have you ever held a grudge so long that it started costing you more than the person who actually wronged you? That's worth sitting with honestly, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable. I'd like to hear about it, if you're willing to share. Bharadvaja, watching all of this unfold from a comfortable distance. Devadatta's downfall was, by this point in the timeline, something people gossiped about in marketplaces, a kind of cautionary tale that made for good conversation precisely because it was someone else's catastrophe. Never once drew the obvious comparison to his own life. He shook his head at Devadatta's excess the way people often shake their heads at extreme versions of their own ordinary habits, comforted by the distance between a man who tried to have boulders rolled onto his cousin and a man who simply raised his voice over a late shipment of grain. He even, on one occasion, found himself in a conversation with a fellow merchant about the whole sorry affair, offering his own opinion freely as he offered opinions on most things. That Devadatta had clearly been a man of weak character to let a single rejection consume an entire life this way. The other merchant, who knew Bharadvaja's reputation reasonably well, said nothing in direct response, only nodded in the careful, non-committal way people nodded at most things Bharadvaja said, and changed the subject shortly afterward. Bharadvaja never noticed the nod for what it likely was, not agreement, but the same practiced deflection his own household had perfected over decades, deployed now by a man who had simply learned, the way most people in this story's marketplace eventually learned, that disagreeing with Bharadvaja rarely seemed worth whatever it might cost. It's a small moment, easy to pass over, but worth pausing on, precisely because it shows how completely a person can fail to recognize their own reflection even when it's standing directly in front of them, dressed in someone else's story. Bharadvaja could see, with total clarity, the exact mechanism by which Devadatta's grudge had consumed his life. He simply couldn't see that same mechanism operating, slower and quieter, in his own. It would take a grove, a teacher, and a question about an uneaten meal to finally show him what the marketplace gossip never could. And even then, it would take years more to fully land. But the shape underneath both stories is closer than Bharadvaja, or perhaps you might initially want to admit. A spark indulged, a justification rehearsed until it feels like simple truth, a pattern repeated long enough that stopping starts to feel less like a possibility than like a kind of self-betrayal, as if putting the grudge down would mean admitting the years spent carrying it were wasted. Devadatta, as far as the tradition records, never did put it down. He carried it to the very end of his life, by some accounts attempting reconciliation only when death was close enough that there was nothing left to lose by trying. According to that account, he set out, ill and weakened, to see the Buddha one final time, having apparently decided, in his last stretch of life, that the grudge was no longer worth whatever it had once felt worth carrying. And he did not survive the journey to complete it. Too late in his case for the reconciliation to be completed in the way he might have wanted. The apology arriving, if it arrived at all, only in the intention behind an unfinished journey rather than in any words actually exchanged between the two men. There's something worth sitting with in the shape of that ending specifically, that even Devadatta, who had sustained a grudge longer and more destructively than almost anyone else in this story, eventually reached, however briefly and however late, the same realization that has been quietly building underneath every chapter so far. That carrying the fire indefinitely costs more than setting it down ever could have. He simply reached that realization too late in his life to do anything useful with it. The lesson was the same lesson Bharadvaja would eventually be offered decades later in a grove. Devadatta's tragedy wasn't that the door was closed to him. It was that he opened it only after nearly all the time he might have spent walking through it had already run out. Keep that in mind as we move forward, because the question this story keeps returning to, at what point does putting the fire down become possible, and what actually makes it possible when it finally happens, is about to get a great deal more interesting and a great deal more hopeful than Devadatta's story alone could suggest. By now you've watched anger destroy a household, a friendship, a kingdom's peace. Here is someone who absorbed all of it and gave none of it back. But first, the question we left hanging back at the palace. What did King Pasenadi's wife's face actually show him in that frozen second before his hand came down? Later that same night, after the servant had been quietly dismissed to bed and the household had settled into its ordinary rhythms again, Pasenadi asked her directly. He wanted to know what she'd been thinking, looking at him like that. She told him, simply, that she hadn't been thinking anything complicated at all. She had simply remembered, in that instant, a younger version of him, the man she'd first known, before the weight of ruling a kingdom had taught him that his temper could move whole rooms of people, could end arguments, could substitute for patience he'd never quite had to develop because shouting had always worked instead. This is the question underneath the question, and it's worth pausing on. She hadn't stopped him with an argument. She'd stopped him by reminding him, without a single accusing word, that he had once been someone else, someone he might still want to be if he let himself. Pasanadi sat with that for a long while that night. He didn't promise her dramatically that it would never happen again. None. He simply said that he hadn't realized until her face showed him how close to the surface that particular version of himself still lived all these years later underneath a king's robes and a king's responsibilities. And in the years that followed, by some accounts, Pasanadi began asking his wife to attend more of his evening audiences than she previously had, not because he distrusted his own judgment on matters of state, but because he had come to value, in a way he hadn't fully appreciated before that frozen moment over a wrong dish, having someone present who knew him well enough to offer that same kind of silent recognition before a smaller version of the same pattern could build towards something larger. It wasn't a perfect solution, and he still had difficult days, still occasionally raised his voice at advisors who deserved better treatment than they received. But the near strike against a frightened servant remained, as far as the records suggest. The closest he ever came to crossing a line he'd spent the rest of his reign quietly, trying not to approach again. A king who had learned in one frozen second exactly how thin the line actually was, and how easily it could have given way that particular evening. The servant himself, for what it's worth, stayed on in the royal household for many more years afterward, eventually rising to a position of modest trust within the kitchens, the near miss of that evening becoming, over time, simply one more story among the staff about the particular evening the king almost lost his temper and somehow, at the very last moment, didn't. Hold that thought, because we're going to need something close to it again much later, in a grove far from any palace. Before we turn to Panna, there's a teaching worth pausing on first, one given by a monk named Sariputta, widely regarded among the Buddha's senior disciples as the one whose explanations could make difficult ideas plain even to people who'd never sat with this kind of teaching before. And a group of younger monks, struggling visibly with their own quick tempers, once came to him asking for something practical. Not philosophy exactly, but a method. A way of actually catching anger before it ran away with them the way it kept running away with them despite their best intentions. Sariputta offered them an image rather than a rule, and he told them to imagine a traveler crossing a hot, dry stretch of country, exhausted, parched, who comes upon water, but the water sits at the bottom of a narrow footprint left by some animal, barely a cupped handful. Muddy and thin. The traveler has a choice. He can kneel down carefully, scoop the water with patience, taking what little is actually usable from a source that doesn't offer much, or he can plunge his whole hand in clumsily, stir up the mud, and ruin even the small amount that might otherwise have quenched his thirst. Anger, Sariputta told them, is exactly this kind of narrow, muddy water. There is almost always a small and usable truth somewhere inside even the most unreasonable provocation. A real grievance, a real hurt, something that deserves acknowledgement. But if you plunge in clumsily, reacting with the full, undisciplined force of your irritation, you stir up everything around that small truth until it becomes useless to you and to everyone nearby. The skill worth developing wasn't the elimination of thirst, he told them. It was learning to kneel down carefully enough, even when parched, even when furious, to draw out only what was actually useful from the moment, rather than ruining the whole pool out of impatience to drink. And one of the younger monks, still unsatisfied, pressed further. What if there simply wasn't time to kneel down carefully? What if the provocation arrived too suddenly, too sharply, for that kind of patience to be practical in the heat of the actual moment? Sariputta answered that the kneeling wasn't a skill you developed in the heat of the moment at all. It was a skill built beforehand, all the quieter moments between provocations, the way a person learns to swim by practicing in calm water long before any current actually threatens to pull them under. By the time the muddy footprint of water appeared in front of you, parched and furious, The kneeling either came naturally because you'd practiced it 100 times in easier conditions, or it didn't come at all because there simply wasn't time left to learn it from scratch in that single difficult instant. This, more than almost anything else said in this telling so far, explains why Bharadvaja's anger never once softened across 70 years of ordinary provocations. He had never practiced kneeling in calm water because he had never once believed there was anything to practice. Every provocation, large or small, had simply received the same full plunge of the hand, year after year, until the muddy reflex was the only reflex he had. It would take an old man's last great provocation in a grove he never wanted to visit, to finally show him that kneeling had been possible all along, even after 70 years of never once trying it. This is, in its own quieter way, the same lesson the cloth seller had stumbled into without any teacher's help, simply by choosing not to add his own fire to Bharadvaja's in the marketplace all those years ago in this story. He had let the muddy water settle rather than plunging his hand in. Bharadvaja, by contrast, had spent his entire life plunging in elbow deep at the first sign of any water at all, hot or cold, clean or muddy, simply because thirst, or the feeling that resembled thirst, the feeling of being wronged and needing immediate relief, had always struck him as more urgent than patience. For now, let's turn to a man whose patience under provocation became, in its own quiet way, just as remarkable as anything you've read so far. Punna was sent by the Buddha himself to teach in a remote, difficult region called Sunaparanta, among people known for their hostility toward outsiders, and especially toward anyone arriving to tell them how to think about anything. The Buddha, before sending him, asked Punna directly what he would do if the people there insulted him, and Punna answered that he would consider them kind because they had only insulted him with words, not struck him. The Buddha pressed further. What if they struck him? Punna said he would still consider them kind, because they had only struck him with their hands, not with stones. And if they struck him with stones, still kind, Punna said, because they had not struck him with a weapon meant to kill. And if they tried to kill him, and here's the part nobody warns you about a question pushed this far. Punna's answer wasn't bravado, and it wasn't despair either. He said that even then, he would consider it a kindness, because they would have freed him from a body that sooner or later was going to die regardless, and freed him without his having had to take that burden onto himself. The Buddha satisfied him, and in Sunaparanta, more or less exactly as predicted, Punna was insulted, then struck, then eventually stoned by people who wanted nothing to do with his teaching. He did not retaliate at any stage. He did not even seem, by the accounts that survive, to experience these escalations as the kind of injury that demanded an equal response. He simply continued, patiently teaching anyone willing to listen, for as long as his body allowed him to. And what the accounts also preserve, though it's mentioned less often than the stoning itself, is what happened afterward in the months that followed. A handful of people in that region, not many, but enough to matter, began approaching him quietly, separately from the crowds that had thrown the stones, asking what exactly he believed that made him capable of absorbing all of it without flinching, without leaving known, without even seeming particularly aggrieved by any of it. He answered them the same way he'd answered the Buddha's original questions, that he had simply stopped believing anything essential could actually be taken from him by an insult, a blow, or a stone, and that once you stop believing that, the things themselves lose most of their power to provoke. Not by the time he died, by some accounts, that hostile region had become one of the more devoted communities in the wider tradition. Not because he had argued anyone into agreement, but because he had simply outlasted their hostility with something they had never encountered before and didn't entirely know what to do with. There's one more thing worth noticing in Punna's answer, because it's easy to mistake for simple resignation, a willingness to be harmed without resistance. It wasn't resignation. It was something closer to a complete absence of the specific ingredient anger needs to ignite. The conviction that something has been taken from you that you're entitled to take back. Punna had apparently let go of that conviction so thoroughly that violence aimed at him simply had nowhere left to land. The same way Anathapindika's calm gave Bharadvaja's shouting nowhere to land in the marketplace. Years earlier in this same story, this brings us to a question that occupied philosophers and monks for centuries after Punna's time, and which found one of its sharpest expressions in a dialogue between a Greek-descended king named Milinda and a monk named Nagasena. Milinda, curious and combative in the way clever rulers often are, pressed Nagasena on a difficult point. If there is no fixed, permanent self, as the teaching claimed, then who, exactly, is angry when anger arises? Who is it that clings, that suffers, that eventually perhaps lets go? Nagasena's answer famously involved a chariot. He asked Milinda to point to the chariot itself, apart from its wheels, its axle, its frame, its reins. And Milinda couldn't do it. The chariot was simply the name given to all those parts working together, not a separate thing existing on its own, hiding somewhere underneath the parts. And the self, Nagasena suggested, works the same way. Anger isn't something a fixed, permanent you possesses the way you might possess a knife or a coin. It's a process, conditions arising, depending on other conditions, the way a wheel depends on an axle to turn at all. Milinda, by most accounts a stubborn debater who didn't concede points easily, pushed back several times before accepting this, trying various ways to locate some fixed core underneath the process Nagasena kept describing. He asked whether memory, then, was the self, since memory seemed to persist where the body didn't. Nagasena pointed out that memory itself changes, fades, gets revised without our noticing. The way a river is still called the same river years later despite none of the original water remaining in it. He asked whether intention was the self, since intention seemed to drive every action a person took. Nagasena agreed that intention mattered enormously, but pointed out that intention, too, arose and passed depending on conditions. Hunger, mood, the company you kept, the years you'd lived. And a thing that depends this thoroughly on conditions outside itself isn't quite the fixed, independent self Milinda was looking for either. By the end of the exchange, Milinda hadn't been defeated so much as gently walked, piece by piece, away from a question that had been built on an assumption that didn't hold up under close examination. This is worth noticing, because it's exactly the kind of examination Bharadvaja had never once applied to his own anger across an entire lifetime. He had simply assumed, the way most people assume, that his anger was simply him. An expression of who he fundamentally was, rather than a process unfolding moment to moment, dependent on 1,000 conditions he'd never bothered to look at closely. This is not a question about chariots. This is not a clever debating trick meant to win an argument. This is not even primarily a question about what the self is made of. It's a question about whether you are stuck being whoever your anger has made you so far, or whether something in you is freer than that, once you look closely enough. Pay attention to this, because it has real consequences for everything Bharadvaja has been doing this entire story without ever stopping to examine it. If anger isn't a fixed possession but a process, dependent on conditions, then it can also be a process that simply stops given different conditions. You are not your anger, the way you're not the chariot's wheel alone. You're the whole moving thing, and a moving thing can change direction. A dose non-hatred is the word the old tradition uses for the absence of that grasping, reactive quality. Not a forced suppression of feeling, but a mind that has simply stopped needing to grab hold of every spark that arrives. And samatha, calm, names the steadier, settled quality of mind that makes a dosa possible to sustain, rather than something you have to white-knuckle your way through in every 6-second window. The way Pasanadi nearly failed too, before his wife's face stopped him. The distinction matters more than it might initially seem to, because willpower and samatha produce results that can look identical from the outside while feeling entirely different from within. Odd. A person relying purely on willpower to suppress their anger in a given moment is still, internally, fighting the anger, holding it down the way you might hold down a lid on something straining against the container. Expending real effort every single second the lid stays shut, and often paying for that effort later in some other form. A headache, a short temper with someone unrelated, a sleepless night replaying the provocation. A person resting in something closer to samatha isn't holding a lid down at all. There's simply less pressure building underneath to begin with, because the mind hasn't grabbed onto the spark in the way Upadana describes. The first kind of calm is exhausting to sustain. The second kind, by every account from people who've spent years cultivating it, becomes less effortful over time rather than more. Centuries later, in Burma, a teacher named Mahasi Sayadaw would develop a method of practice built almost entirely around this same insight, training students to simply notice, label, and observe whatever arose in the mind, anger included, without immediately acting on it or pushing it away. Noting, he called the basic technique, anger arising, notice it, name it, anger, and watch what it actually does, moment to moment, and when it isn't fed by argument or action. Students who practiced this for years reported something almost identical to what Nagasena had argued centuries earlier through pure logic. That anger, watched closely enough, stops behaving like a solid thing you possess and starts behaving like weather passing through a sky that was never the storm itself. One student under this method, a layperson rather than a monk, later described an experience that captures the practice's strange, quiet power better than any abstract description could. He had a colleague at work who reliably provoked him, a small, recurring friction over shared responsibilities that had built over months into something he dreaded encountering every single day. He began applying the noting technique specifically to this relationship, not by avoiding the colleague or rehearsing comebacks, but simply by noticing the instant irritation arose in a meeting or a hallway exchange, and naming it plainly to himself. Irritation, tightness. And he expected at first that this would feel like suppression, like swallowing something that wanted to come out. Instead, he reported, the named irritation tended to lose its grip within moments, sometimes seconds, in a way that simply trying to ignore it had never once managed to do. The colleague hadn't changed. The friction itself hadn't disappeared. What had changed was his relationship to the feeling that friction produced in him, and that shift alone, repeated daily over months, eventually made the entire working relationship bearable in a way years of avoidance and resentment never had. What he found most surprising, telling this story later, wasn't that the technique worked. It was how little effort it actually took compared to everything he'd tried before. The rehearsed comebacks, the avoidance strategies, the long evenings spent replaying arguments that had never even happened. Simply naming the feeling plainly and without elaboration turned out to require less energy than feeding it ever had, which struck him, in hindsight, as exactly backward from what he'd always assumed about anger. That managing it would be the harder path and indulging it the easier one. He had spent years on the harder path without realizing there was an easier one sitting quietly underneath it the whole time. Bharadvaja, across this entire telling, never once suspected the same easier path might have been sitting underneath his own 70 years of fire, waiting the whole time simply to be noticed. The way a door left unlocked the entire time still requires someone, eventually, to actually try the handle. And here's the part that still surprises people encountering this for the first time. This isn't a claim that anger should be ignored, suppressed, or pretended away. It's closer to the opposite, a claim that anger, looked at directly and patiently enough, simply doesn't hold together the way it insists it will in the first hot instant of feeling it. Centuries before any of this, long before Mahasi Sayadaw, long before Melinda's dialogue with Nagasena, a king named Ashoka had already lived out a version of this same realization on a scale few people ever face. After a campaign of conquest so brutal it left hundreds of thousands dead, he found himself, by his own later account, no longer able to look at what force had actually accomplished beyond grief multiplied many times over. He turned, deliberately and publicly, toward a different kind of rule entirely. One built on what he called conquest by Dhamma rather than conquest by the sword. Recorded permanently in stone so that no later ruler reading his edicts could mistake what he'd come to believe cost too much to ever justify again. What's worth adding to the picture here, beyond what was said of him earlier in this telling, is how thoroughly that transformation reshaped the actual machinery of his rule, not merely his private reflections. He established what amounted to a new class of officials specifically tasked with overseeing the welfare of his subjects, built hospitals and rest houses along major roads for travelers and the sick, and planted trees for shade in places he had once marched armies through. None of it undid the dead from Kalinga. He never claimed it did. No. But it suggested that the realization which had broken open in him wasn't simply private remorse, the kind that fades quietly with time and changes nothing external. It became instead the actual organizing principle of the remaining decades of his rule. This is the moment everything starts to turn across this whole story towards something other than its own momentum. If a king who had killed at that scale could find his way to a different conviction, and if a murderer who'd collected 1,000 fingers could stop on a forest road and mean it, and the question hanging over Bharadvaja, whether an old man's anger, decades deep, could ever actually be set down, is no longer a question this story needs to treat as hopeless. It's simply a question of what it would take. And we're about to start finding out. If you've ever wondered whether you yourself are too far along some old pattern to change it, hold that question gently for a while longer. You're going to want it close by for what comes next. Now you've seen what anger does when it's fed. It's time to see what grief looks like when it isn't turned into rage at all. There was a young woman named Kisa Gotami, married into a wealthy family, who had longed for a child for years before finally giving birth to a son. She loved him the particular, fierce way a parent loves a child they weren't sure they'd ever have. And then, while he was still small enough to carry on her hip, he died, the kind of sudden, ordinary, devastating death that happened constantly in a world without the medicine that might have saved him. And that broke her completely regardless of how common it was. Here's what most people miss about grief at its most extreme. It doesn't always look like sadness from the outside. Sometimes it looks like refusal. Kisa Gotami refused to believe her son was dead. She carried his small body from house to house throughout her village, and then beyond it asked everyone she met for medicine that might revive him, while the people around her exchanged the particular look reserved for someone whose mind has clearly broken under more weight than it could bear. Eventually, someone gentler than the rest told her there was a teacher nearby who might have the medicine she was searching for. She found him and asked him directly. The Buddha told her that yes, he could provide what she needed, but first, she would need to bring him a handful of mustard seed, taken from a house where no one had ever died. She set out immediately, certain this would be simple. Every house had mustard seed. It was one of the most common household items there was. She went to the first house and asked. They had mustard seed, certainly, but the grandmother had died the previous year. She went to the next house, mustard seed, yes, but a child had died there too some years back. House after house, the same pattern. The seed was always there. The death in every single household was there too. By midday, she had stopped asking only for the seed. She had started asking, almost without meaning to, what had happened in each house. How long ago, how old the person had been, whether it had come suddenly or slowly. People answered her, mostly with patience, recognizing perhaps something of their own earlier grief in the way she asked, the particular hunger of someone trying to understand whether what had happened to them was as singular as it felt. Owned. An old man told her about a wife he'd buried decades earlier, his voice steady now in a way it clearly hadn't always been. A young couple, married only a few years, told her about a firstborn who hadn't survived his first winter, and she watched something pass briefly across both their faces. Not fresh grief exactly, but the visible trace of where fresh grief had once been, smoothed now by years but never entirely erased. And by the time the sun began lowering, she had visited more houses than she could easily count, and the basket she'd brought for the seed remained as empty as it had been that morning. Though something else in her had filled considerably in its place. Notice what happened to her slowly over the course of that walk. She had set out searching for a cure. What she found instead, walking from door to door, was the plain fact that every household she entered was carrying some version of exactly what she was carrying. Not lighter versions, not easier ones. Just versions that had happened slightly longer ago. To people who had somehow learned to keep living anyway. You may have walked something close to this same path yourself at some point, even if no one handed you a basket and sent you door to door. The slow, surprising discovery that your grief, however singular it feels, has been walked before by people all around you who simply never mentioned it. By the time she returned to the Buddha, empty-handed, something in her had already shifted. She told him she understood now that death was not a singular cruelty visited on her alone, but the one truly universal condition every household eventually shared, whether it had happened yet in that particular house or not. This is where the story turns in a direction worth sitting with carefully, because it would be easy to mistake what happened to her for resignation, the same easy misreading we had to set aside back when we watched Punna take stones without flinching. It wasn't resignation. It was something closer to the loosening of an isolation that had made her grief feel, in its earliest days, unbearable, specifically because it felt singular, as if she alone had been chosen for this particular wound, while the rest of the world simply continued, untouched, around her. And she did not stop grieving her son. The story doesn't claim anything that tidy. What she stopped doing was carrying that grief as proof that she'd been uniquely wronged by the universe, the same conviction that had been fueling Bharadvaja's fury for an entire lifetime by this point in the story, the sense that his suffering, his inconvenience, his disrespect was always somehow more unjust, more deserving of response than anyone else's. There's a second woman whose story sits alongside Kisa Gotami's in the tradition, and whose losses were, if anything, harder to absorb. And Padakara had married against her family's wishes, choosing a servant in her parents' household over the more advantageous match they'd arranged for her, and the marriage, against the odds such beginnings usually face, had been a genuinely happy one in the years before catastrophe found her. She was traveling to visit her parents, specifically to reconcile, finally, after years of estrangement over that choice of husband, carrying her 2 young children with her, hoping the visit might heal a rift she had carried quietly for most of her adult life. Padakara lost her husband to a snake bite while they were traveling. In the same span of hours, struggling alone to manage what had happened, she lost both of her young children as well. One to a river crossing, one to a bird of prey, in a sequence of loss that's hard to absorb all at once. She continued walking in shock toward her parents' home, only to learn on arrival that a storm had collapsed the house the previous night, killing both of her parents and her brother in a single blow. In the space of one day, she lost every member of her immediate family. By most accounts, she did not turn calmly toward wisdom in the immediate aftermath the way later, simplified retellings sometimes suggest. And she wandered for a long stretch afterward in something closer to madness than grief, by the description preserved in the tradition, her clothing in disarray, speaking to strangers as though they might somehow restore what had been taken from her in a single day, the kind of unraveling that anyone witnessing it would have recognized as a mind that had simply been asked to hold more than a mind can reasonably be expected to hold. It was in this state, wandering and disoriented, that she eventually crossed paths with the Buddha, and something in his presence, Not a lecture, not an argument, simply a steadiness she hadn't encountered anywhere else in her wandering. Gave her enough of a foothold to begin, slowly, the long work of putting herself back together. Pay attention to this, because what came next is the part that distinguishes her story from a simple catalog of tragedy. And Patakara did not turn this loss into rage at the world, at fate, at the people around her who still had what she'd lost. She turned eventually toward the same teacher Kisa Gotami had found, and through years of practice and grief worked all the way through rather than around. She became one of the most respected teachers in the entire early community, known specifically for her ability to sit with other grieving women and help them find their way through losses that might otherwise have calcified into permanent bitterness. One particular encounter from her later years as a teacher has survived in some detail. A woman came to her inconsolable, having lost an infant son to a fever that had taken him within a single night, and the woman's grief had already begun curdling into something harder and more bitter than grief alone. Anger at the physician who hadn't come quickly enough. Anger at her husband for being away on business when it happened. Anger, in her most honest moments, at the child himself for leaving her. An anger she was deeply ashamed of and had told no one about until she found herself, almost without deciding to, telling Patakara. Patakara did not tell her the anger was wrong to feel, or that she should simply let it go, the way well-meaning but less experienced comforters sometimes do, offering advice that asks a grieving person to perform a peace they haven't actually reached. She told her instead about the day she'd lost her husband, her 2 children, and her entire family within the same single turn of the sun, and the version of herself that had wandered afterward half out of her mind, blaming everyone and no one, the world and herself, roughly equal and exhausting measure. She told the woman that the anger wasn't a betrayal of her grief. It was simply grief that hadn't yet found a place to set itself down, looking for somewhere, anything, anyone, to make sense of a loss that fundamentally didn't make sense, because that's what unbearable losses do to a mind that's trying, understandably, to find some kind of explanation it can hold on to. What helped end? Patakara told her wasn't forcing the anger to disappear. It was simply staying close to the actual grief underneath it long enough and patiently enough that the grief eventually stopped needing the anger to carry it. The woman stayed with Patakara for some time afterward, and by most accounts found her way, slowly, towards something that let her speak her son's name again, without the conversation collapsing immediately into rage at people who, in the end, had not actually wanted her son to die any more than she had. It's a small story, easy to lose among the larger figures and larger tragedies this telling has gathered, but it carries something none of the larger stories quite manage on their own. Proof that the path out of anger doesn't always require a dramatic confrontation in a grove, or 1,000 fingers worth of reckoning, or a king's empire-sized grief. Sometimes it simply requires one person who has already walked the same road further than you have, willing to sit with you long enough that you stop needing to blame anyone at all. Bharadvaja, for most of his life, had never once let anyone sit with him that long. Here's the part that's easy to misread if you've never sat with grief this large yourself. Neither woman's path involved suppressing what had happened to them, or pretending it didn't matter, or rushing toward some falsely cheerful acceptance. Both of them went through something that, by any reasonable measure, gave them every right to be furious at the world for as long as they lived. And both of them found, instead, a way to let that grief become wisdom rather than rage. Not because rage wasn't available to them, but because they discovered the hard way that rage wouldn't actually give them back anything that mattered. There's a word for the clear seeing that becomes possible once a person stops needing their suffering to mean something other than what it actually is. Vipassana, often translated simply as insight, though The word carries more precision than that translation quite captures. A seeing through, a seeing of things exactly as they are rather than as you wish they were or fear they might be. And there's a companion word, ahimsa, non-harming. Not merely the absence of violence toward others, but a quality of mind that has stopped generating the harm internally in the first place. The harm of constantly rehearsing your own grievances until they become weapons aimed in every direction, including back at yourself. Bharadvaja, somewhere in his own life during this same general period, lost his own father. An ordinary death, by ordinary old age, nothing like the cascading horror Patakara endured. And his grief, rather than opening him the way it eventually opened these two women, simply became one more grievance in his collection. Anger at the physicians who hadn't saved his father fast enough. Anger at relatives who he felt hadn't grieved sufficiently in front of him. Anger even at his father himself, in some confused and never examined way, for leaving him to manage a household and a legacy alone. At the funeral rites themselves, Bharadvaja found himself to his own private confusion, more irritated than grieved. Irritated at a cousin who arrived late, irritated at the priests pacing through the ceremony, irritated at his own brother for weeping more visibly than Bharadvaja felt was appropriate, given how rarely, in Bharadvaja's private accounting, that brother had actually visited their father in his final years. None of this irritation had anywhere honest to go, because none of it was really about the cousin's lateness or the priest's pacing or his brother's tears. It was grief wearing the only clothing Bharadvaja had ever owned for any large feeling. The clothing of being wronged by someone, needing someone specific to blame for a loss that, in this case, belonged to nobody at all. He stood through his own father's funeral composing, in some quiet corner of his mind, an argument he never actually delivered to his brother about insufficient devotion, never once noticing that the argument itself was the grief, badly translated into a language that had never learned any other way to speak. The distance this created between the two brothers lasted for years afterward, neither of them quite able to name what had actually gone wrong between them at the funeral, both simply carrying forward a coolness neither had consciously decided to create. It would be this same brother, much later in this story, whose choice to take up the role Bharadvaja would experience as betrayal rather than as the natural continuation of a distance Bharadvaja himself had quietly authored years earlier and never once revisited. This is worth noticing, because it's a pattern that runs underneath so much of what happens in this story, not only in Bharadvaja's life. The version of events we carry forward in our own minds is rarely the same version the people around us are carrying on. Bharadvaja remembered his brother's tears at the funeral as a kind of performance, a slight against their father's memory. His brother almost certainly remembered the same afternoon as the moment he first understood how thoroughly his own grief would always come second in that household to whatever grievance Bharadvaja happened to be nursing instead. Both men walked away from the same funeral carrying a wound the other had no idea he'd inflicted, and both wounds quietly shaped a decade's worth of distance between them before either fully understood why the distance was there at all. What's the difference between grief and anger in your own experience? I think it's a harder question than it sounds, and I'd genuinely like to know what you think down in the comments. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we move forward into the final stretch of this story. Kisa Gotami and Patakara both lost everything anyone could reasonably be asked to bear, and neither of them needed someone else to suffer in return to feel. Eventually, that something like peace was possible again. Bharadvaja, by contrast, has spent an entire lifetime believing that someone else is suffering. An apology extracted, an argument won. A household managed through fear rather than warmth was the only currency capable of settling what he felt he was owed. He is about to meet someone who refuses completely and calmly to pay him in that currency. And it is going to be the strangest encounter of his entire life. Their grief never curdled into hatred. But you may be asking, what about anger at something bigger than one person? What about a whole world on fire? Hema had been a queen once, celebrated for her beauty, married to a king who adored her, living the kind of life that gives a person every reason to believe the world has arranged itself entirely in their favor. And she avoided the Buddha's teaching for a long time, specifically because she'd heard he spoke about the impermanence of beauty, and she had no interest in hearing anything that might diminish the one thing she'd built her entire identity around. Her husband, the king, had become a devoted follower of the teaching sometime before she had, and he wanted, intently and persistently, for his wife to visit the grove and hear the teacher for herself. She refused for years, finding reasons each time. Too busy with the affairs of the court, uninterested in religious matters, certain in private that whatever wisdom the teacher had to offer would amount to one more attempt to convince a beautiful woman that her beauty didn't matter, which struck her, given how much of her life had been organized around that beauty, as both insulting and beside the point. And eventually her husband arranged something closer to a trick than an invitation, having musicians and poets praise the grove's beauty in her hearing until her own curiosity, rather than any sense of duty, finally walked her there herself, expecting nothing more than a pleasant garden to admire. When she finally did encounter him, drawn by some accounts almost against her will, by a vision he created showing her own beauty aging and decaying in accelerated stages before her eyes, something in her broke open rather than simply breaking. She didn't respond with anger at having been confronted this way, though anger would have been an understandable response to feeling manipulated into a difficult realization. She responded instead with a kind of clear, sudden grief that moved quickly into something steadier, and she eventually became one of the two foremost female disciples in the entire community, celebrated specifically for the depth of her wisdom. In her later years as a teacher, Kima became known for a particular kind of conversation with people, often other women of standing, who came to her struggling with the loss of something they'd built their entire identity around. Beauty, certainly, but just as often status, wealth, the regard of a husband or a court that had since moved its attention elsewhere. She never told them the loss didn't matter. She had lost the same thing herself, after all, the most direct way possible, watching her own face age decades within a single vision. What she offered instead was the observation that the identity built around any single possession, beauty, status, certainty in your own rightness, was always going to be temporary, because everything it was built on was temporary, and that the real question wasn't how to keep what you'd built from changing, which was never possible, but what remained of you once the thing you'd organized your whole sense of self around had finally gone. And Bharadvaja's own version of this same question, what remains of you once the certainty you've built your whole identity around is finally taken from you in a grove you never wanted to visit, was still decades away from him at this point in the story. But the shape of the question Kima answered for grieving queens was, underneath its different costume, exactly the question waiting for him at the end of his own road. And here's what most people miss about a transformation like Kima's. It would have been entirely reasonable for her to feel violated by how she was confronted, and to respond with the same defensive fury Bharadvaja reaches for at the slightest provocation. She didn't. She let the confrontation do its work instead of fighting it, the way you might let a difficult truth from a friend land instead of immediately explaining why the friend was wrong to say it. But Kima's path to wisdom, however remarkable, was still primarily personal. Her own beauty, at her own eventual letting go. There's a layer underneath this worth noticing before we move on. What happens when the anger in question isn't personal at all? What happens when the suffering you're angry about is happening to thousands of people you've never met, in a war you didn't start and can't single-handedly end? This question found one of its sharpest modern answers in the life of a Vietnamese monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, who lived through a war that tore his country apart for decades, watching villages he'd grown up near burn, watching young monks he'd trained alongside die in bombing raids meant for entirely different targets, watching a conflict consume an entire generation of his people while much of the rest of the world debated it from a comfortable distance as an abstraction rather than a daily grinding loss. He founded during these years a school dedicated to social work and rural development, training young volunteers to rebuild villages that had been destroyed, to care for the wounded on every side of a conflict that had stopped by that point, distinguishing clearly between combatants and the families simply caught living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Several of those young volunteers, people he had personally trained and come to love the way a teacher comes to love students who remind him of his own younger convictions, were killed during their work, not as soldiers, but as people trying to carry medicine and rice into villages that artillery from multiple sides had already decided were acceptable casualties. He carried each of those deaths personally, by his own later account, in a way that never fully left him for the rest of his long life. He had every reason, by any ordinary measure, to be furious at the foreign governments fueling the war, at the factions tearing his country apart from within, at a world that seemed willing to let his homeland burn as long as the fire stayed contained within its borders. And in letters he wrote during those years, he didn't pretend the fury wasn't there. He described it directly, without the false serenity people sometimes assume a monk is required to perform. There's a layer underneath this worth noticing too, about what he actually wrote and taught during this period. Never argued that the anger itself was wrong to feel, or that a person facing this much loss should simply transcend it through willpower. What he argued instead was something closer to a complete reframing of what you do with anger once it arrives. Not suppress it, not deny it, but hold it the way you would hold a crying infant. You don't slap a crying baby for crying. You don't shout at it to be quiet. You pick it up gently and you hold it, and you let it cry against you until it settles. Because the crying isn't an enemy to be defeated. It's a signal. Uncomfortable, demanding, impossible to ignore, that something inside needs care. This is the moment everything in this story has been quietly building toward. Even all the way back to that boy standing over a broken jar in the very first part of this telling. Anger in this reframing isn't a fire to be fought or a fire to be fed, and it's something closer to a child crying out because something hurts, and what it actually needs, almost every single time, isn't an opponent to defeat or a target to punish. It's someone, even remarkably angry person themselves, willing to hold it with enough tenderness that it can finally stop screaming long enough to be heard. Thich Nhat Hanh held his own rage at the war this way, by his own account, not for years, not extinguishing it, not pretending it away, but refusing to let it curdle into the kind of hatred that would have made him indistinguishable from the violence he was grieving. He worked instead, for peace through channels that never required him to become, even briefly, the thing he was opposing, traveling abroad to speak directly to audiences and governments who had the power to influence the war's continuation, even when doing so meant he could not safely return to his own country for many years afterward, a separation from his homeland that became its own long, quiet grief layered on top of the wars. And he held the crying child of his own fury close enough, for long enough, that it eventually settled into something he could work from rather than something working him. What's worth noticing in this, especially set against everything Bharadvaja has done across this entire story, is that holding the anger this way never once required Thich Nhat Hanh to stop caring about the outcome, to soften his commitment to ending the suffering he was witnessing. If anything, the opposite was true. The years of work he was able to sustain, decades of it, long after a man fueled purely by reactive fury might reasonably have burned out or turned bitter, were made possible specifically because his anger had somewhere stable to rest rather than a constant fire requiring fresh fuel just to keep him standing. There's a Pali word, that sits underneath all of this, one we haven't introduced yet, despite how much this entire story has been circling it from every angle. Karuna, compassion. Not the soft, sentimental version the word sometimes gets reduced to, but a clear-eyed, active willingness to turn directly towards suffering, including your own, and instead of converting that suffering into a weapon aimed at whoever seems closest to blame. Centuries before Thich Nhat Hanh, a different king faced a related question on a different continent entirely, and a chronicle called the Mahavamsa, preserving the early history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, records a ruler who, after a war fought to unify a divided land, found himself haunted afterward by the scale of death the unification had required, and who turned deliberately toward restitution and restraint rather than toward further conquest, building monuments and supporting the wounded on both sides of the conflict he'd just fought, refusing to let victory curdle into the kind of triumphant cruelty that so often follows war. And the chronicle records that in the aftermath of his final victory, rather than celebrating in the manner victorious kings of that era typically did, he fell into a period of visible grief that troubled his closest advisors, who had expected triumph and found instead a man unable to take any satisfaction from what he'd won. When asked what troubled him, he is recorded as saying that he could not find joy in a victory purchased at the cost of so many lives on both sides. Not only the soldiers he had commanded, but the soldiers who had opposed him, each one someone's son, someone's husband, someone whose absence would be felt in a household that had nothing to do with the throne either man had been fighting over. He commissioned, in the years that followed, a program of public works and religious offerings specifically dedicated to the memory of the fallen from both armies, a gesture that startled observers accustomed to victors who simply erased the memory of those they'd defeated. And the chronicle frames this not as weakness following strength, but as a harder, rarer strength, the strength to stop reaching for vengeance once the original threat no longer required it. Can you be angry at something genuinely unjust, a war, a cruelty, a wrong done to people you love, without becoming even briefly a mirror of the very thing you're angry at? That's a question worth sitting with honestly rather than answering quickly. Tell me down in the comments how you've held that line in your own life, if you've ever had to. There's one more thing worth carrying forward into the final stretch of this story, because we're very close now to the grove, to the old man, to everything the very beginning of this telling promised you we'd eventually return to. Bharadvaja has spent his entire life treating his own anger as an enemy that must be defeated by someone, somehow, either by him, through force against everyone who provokes him, or he secretly fears by anger itself. None. Defeating him in some final and humiliating way, he's never quite let himself picture clearly. He has never once considered Thich Nhat Hanh's reframing, because he has never met anyone willing to suggest it to him directly, in a way he might actually hear he is about to. Everything you've watched, the boy, the merchant, the murderer, the king, the grieving women, the mother holding her rage like a child, has been leading here, to the grove. Now the old man. Bharadvaja was old now. His hair had gone gray, his hands had grown thinner, but the fire that had lived in him since he was 7 years old, standing over a broken jar, had not dimmed with age the way some people's tempers do. If anything, it had sharpened. The particular bitterness of a man who has spent decades winning every argument and somehow ending up by the end of his life with fewer people around him than he started with. His younger brother had recently done something Bharadvaja considered a betrayal almost beyond forgiveness. He had gone to hear the teacher everyone in the region had started talking about, the same teacher whose name had drifted through this story for a long while now without Bharadvaja ever once stopping to listen closely. And his brother had not simply listened. He had been ordained, he had shaved his head, taken up the robe and walked away from the family business, the family disputes, the family temper entirely. Here's the part nobody warns you about news like this. When it reaches someone like Bharadvaja, he didn't experience it as his brother finding peace. He experienced it as his brother abandoning him, choosing a stranger's teaching over a lifetime of blood ties, and worse, choosing serenity over solidarity with a brother who had never once asked him to be calm, only to be loyal. So he did what he had always done with feelings too large to sit still with. He went looking for the source of the fire, intending to put it out the only way he knew how, with his voice in public, until the source either backed down or broke. The walk to the grove took the better part of a morning, long enough for an old man's body to remind him, with every aching step, that he was no longer young, that the legs carrying him toward this confrontation were not the same legs that had once shoved a boy into a river without a second thought. He used the time, the way he had used every long walk before every confrontation of his life, to rehearse. He built his opening line, discarded it, built a sharper one. He imagined the teacher's face crumbling under the weight of what he was about to say. Imagine the small crowd of listeners turning, one by one, away from a fraud finally exposed for what he was. He had built versions of this victory in his mind 1,000 times before, against 1,000 smaller opponents, and every previous time, more or less, the rehearsal had matched the reality closely enough that he'd stopped questioning whether it would. Somewhere along that walk, an old memory surfaced uninvited. His brother, years younger, known, following him around their childhood home the way younger brothers do. Watching him the way you watch someone you've decided is strong enough to keep you safe. There was a particular afternoon buried in that memory, from decades earlier, when his brother had come to him after being mocked by other boys in the village, asking with the simple trust of a much younger sibling what he should do about it. Bharadvaja had told him to hit back harder than he'd been hit, to make sure the mocking never happened again, and his brother had done exactly that, and the mocking had indeed stopped. And for years afterward, Bharadvaja had held that moment up to himself as evidence of good guidance well given. It had never once occurred to him until this walk toward the grove decades later. I wonder what else his brother might have absorbed from that advice beyond the specific lesson about that specific bully. He pushed the memory down before it could finish forming into anything resembling tenderness. There would be time for memories after he'd settled this. First, the settling. He found the teacher in a grove not far from where he lived, seated, surrounded by a small group of listeners, in the middle of an ordinary morning that had given Bharadvaja no actual reason at all to be there other than the reason that had driven nearly every encounter of his entire life. Someone, somewhere, had done something he'd decided to be furious about. He didn't wait for an opening. He didn't pause to consider what he might actually say, the way he never had, across an entire lifetime of confrontations that had all, some sense, been rehearsals for this one. He simply began, loudly, immediately, with the particular fluency of a man who has had decades of practice turning grievance into insult without a single pause for breath. He called the teacher a fraud. He called him a thief of families, a man who stole sons from fathers and brothers from brothers under the guise of peace. He used words designed the way they had always been designed, to wound rather than to argue. Words aimed not at the teaching itself, which he hadn't actually examined, but at the man's character, his motives, his right to exist as something other than the villain Bharadvaja had already decided he must be. This is the moment everything in this story has been building toward. And here's what nobody watching could have predicted, even though the whole story has been quietly preparing you for it the entire time. The teacher said nothing while Bharadvaja shouted. Not the cold, simmering nothing of Bharadvaja's own household decades earlier. None. A different kind of silence entirely, attentive, unhurried. The silence of someone who had clearly heard every word and simply hadn't found, in any of them, anything that required a defense. Bharadvaja kept going on. The crowd that had gathered, expecting either capitulation or confrontation, got the same strange nothing Anathapindika had once given him in a marketplace decades earlier, except magnified, sustained, possible to provoke past a certain point no matter how far Bharadvaja pushed. Eventually, having said everything he'd come to say, and likely a great deal more besides, the way anger tends to generate its own momentum past the point of anything actually needing saying, he stopped, breathing hard, waiting for the response he had spent his entire life training every opponent to give him, a capitulation or a fight he could win. The teacher looked at him for a moment, and then he asked a simple question. He asked whether Bharadvaja ever had guests at his home, friends, family, visitors who came to share a meal with him. Bharadvaja, thrown by the strangeness of the question, said that of course he did. And what, the teacher asked, would happen to the food prepared for those guests? No, if the guests simply never arrived, if, for whatever reason, no one came to eat what had been laid out for them. Bharadvaja, irritated now by what seemed like an evasion, said that the food would simply remain his untouched. Still his, since no one had come to claim it. Here's where the story turns. Finally, after this entire long journey of waiting for this exact moment, the teacher said that this was precisely what had just happened with everything Bharadvaja had shouted at him. He had prepared a feast of abuse, brought it here with great effort, and offered it. The teacher had simply not come to the table. The insults, untouched, remained entirely Bharadvaja's own, still his, the way the uneaten meal remains the host's, since no guest had ever actually arrived to claim it. Pay attention to what happens in Bharadvaja's face in this moment, because it's the same face, in a sense, that's been forming since he was 7 years old standing over a broken jar. Confusion, first, and something closer to vertigo. The particular dizziness of someone who has spent an entire lifetime assuming a fight requires 2 willing participants, only to discover, in his old age, that it never actually did. And he had been fighting alone the entire time in every argument he'd ever won, shouting into rooms that simply absorbed his fire without ever needing to catch it. The teacher continued gently now, not without any trace of triumph in having made the point. He said that when someone returns anger for anger, they share in the meal. They take a portion of the poison being offered and make it their own, doubling what exists in the room rather than ending it. But when someone simply doesn't take what's offered, the giver is left holding the whole of it, alone. Exactly the way Bharadvaja was standing there now, holding decades of fury that had, somehow, never once actually landed anywhere outside himself. Bharadvaja, recovering some of his footing, tried once more, not with the same volume as before, but with something sharper or pointed, the last reserve of a man who has spent his whole life unable to leave an argument unfinished. He asked the teacher whether this meant a person should simply let themselves be wronged endlessly, not take whatever abuse the world offered without ever pushing back, without ever defending what was theirs. It sounded to him like an argument for weakness dressed up in calm language. Teacher answered that he hadn't said anything about what should be defended or pursued through other means. A fair price, a broken promise, a genuine wrong that needed addressing. He was speaking only of the specific moment when someone offers you their hatred directly, hoping you'll match it. Defending your interests and matching someone's hatred, he said, are 2 entirely different acts that happen to look similar from a distance. The way 2 roads might run parallel for a stretch before diverging completely. A person could refuse the second without ever giving up the first. Bharadvaja sat with this longer than he'd sat with anything in years, turning it over the way you might turn over a coin, to check both faces. He asked finally, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier fire, what a man was supposed to do then. With 70 years' worth of feasts, nobody had ever come to eat. All the old arguments, all the grudges he'd carried that had never once actually been resolved by being won. The teacher told him that the feasts didn't need to be served to anyone at this point. They simply needed, finally, to stop being cooked. What had already been prepared could be set down, examined, even grieved a little, without needing to be offered to anyone ever again. Bharadvaja asked one more question, quieter than the others, almost to himself rather than to the teacher in front of him. Whether it was too late at his age, after 70 years of practice at exactly the opposite of what was being described, to actually learn to do this. The teacher answered that he had asked Punna once whether age made a difference to this kind of change, and Punna had said that fire doesn't ask how long the wood has been burning before it can finally be allowed to go out. It simply needs, eventually, for someone to stop feeding it. 70 years of fuel meant there was more banked heat to work through than a younger man might have carried. It did not mean the fire was somehow exempt from the same simple fact that governs every fire there has ever been. This is not a story about winning an argument. This is not a story about who shouted louder, or who held their ground, or who proved themselves right in front of a crowd of witnesses. This is a story about a man who finally, after 70-some years of carrying a feast no one had ever truly come to share, found himself standing in front of someone who simply would not sit down at his table. Bharadvaja said nothing for a long moment. The crowd, expecting some final retort, some last attempt to salvage the confrontation he'd come here to win, got silence instead. Bharadvaja's silence for once, and rather than anyone else's careful management of his mood. The small gathering that had assembled to watch dispersed slowly in the particular way crowds disperse after witnessing something they don't quite have language for yet. A few of them would talk about it for years afterward. The old Brahmin who came to shout and left without a word, though none of them, watching from outside, could have said with any certainty what exactly had passed between the two men beyond the visible shape of it. Fury arriving, fury finding nothing to push against, fury finally, mysteriously, going quiet. The teacher himself returned to his seat among his listeners, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all, picking up some thread of an earlier conversation, while Bharadvaja stood a moment longer in the grove before turning toward the road home, carrying something he didn't yet have words for either. He turned and walked home that evening without having said another word, and his wife was waiting for him when he arrived, older now too, after decades of careful footsteps and careful silences in a house that had organized itself entirely around his weather for as long as either of them could remember. She had been waiting, though she might not have been able to say exactly what for, the way you wait for news from a long journey without knowing whether it will be good or bad. What she found when he came through the gate was not the man who had left that morning, furious, certain of his cause. It was someone quieter, not transformed completely, not some instant, miraculous saint replacing 70 years of habit in a single afternoon, just quieter, carrying something differently than he had carried it that morning. She had spent the day as she spent most days when he was out settling some grievance or another, half listening for the sound of his footsteps at the gate, having learned over decades to read the pace and weight of those footsteps the way other people read a letter before opening it. The footsteps that evening were slower than usual and lighter somehow. Not, despite his evident exhaustion, not the heavy, deliberate tread of a man returning from a battle he intended to discuss at length, but something closer to the uncertain steps of someone who had walked a long way carrying something he hadn't yet figured out how to set down. She did not ask him directly what had happened. And, having learned long ago that direct questions on evenings like this tended to either go unanswered or answered in a way that cost more than the asking was worth, she simply set out the evening meal as she always did and waited, the way she had waited through 40 years of evenings, for whatever the silence would eventually decide to become. He didn't explain everything that had happened in the grove. He simply said eventually, after a long silence at the evening meal, that he thought he understood now why anger had never actually settled anything in his entire life. Not because his opponents had been wrong to provoke him. He wasn't ready. yet to extend that kind of generosity backward across decades of arguments. But because every fight he'd ever won had still left him afterward exactly as full of fire as he'd been before it started. Winning had never once emptied him of anything. It had simply confirmed each time that the fire was still there, waiting for its next occasion. She listened without interrupting, not the way she had learned to listen to him across an entire marriage, though this particular silence of hers felt different from the careful, watchful silence of decades past. This one had something almost like hope folded into it, cautious and unpracticed, the way you might allow yourself to hope about weather that has been bad for so long you've nearly forgotten what to do with a clear sky. That, he said quietly, might be the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him. She reached across the small table between them, then an unremarkable gesture in most marriages, but one that had grown rare enough in theirs over the decades that both of them seemed to register its weight at the same moment. Neither of them said anything else about the grove that night. There was, it turned out, nothing else that needed saying just yet. Only the quiet, ordinary fact of two old people finishing a meal together without anyone in the room needing to manage anything at all. Adosa, non-hatred, and viraga, dispassion, are words that don't capture fully what happened to Bharadvaja in that grove, because what happened wasn't a sudden, complete absence of fire. It was something smaller and more honest than that. The first moment, 70 years, where he could see the fire clearly enough to recognize it as something he was choosing to carry, rather than something the world kept forcing into his hands against his will. If you've made it this far into this story, I want to ask you something directly because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this whole telling. What's the feast you're still carrying? The argument, the grudge, no, the old insult that no one has ever actually come to share with you, no matter how many times you've laid it out, hoping someone would finally sit down and eat. We're almost at the end now. But there's one more quiet thing worth saying about what actually happened to a man who spent his whole life believing his anger was the only thing keeping him safe. He walked home that evening a quieter man. Not a perfect one, just quieter. In the years that remained to him, Bharadvaja did not become someone unrecognizable to the people who had known him his whole life. He still had a temper. He still, on certain days, found himself reaching for the old, familiar heat when something went wrong. A habit 70 years deep doesn't unlearn itself in a single afternoon in a grove, no matter how clean the teaching that landed there. But something had changed underneath the habit, even when the habit itself still showed up. He began to notice the reaching, sometimes before he'd fully committed to it. He began to ask himself in the half-second before the old fluency took over whether he actually wanted to lay out another feast that no one was going to come and eat. Sometimes he still laid it out anyway, but sometimes, increasingly as the years went on, he didn't. And his wife, watching him from the same careful distance she'd kept for decades, noticed something she hadn't dared to hope for after this many years of careful footsteps. The house slowly began to breathe differently, not because he'd stopped being himself, because the fire that had organized every room he walked into for most of his life had finally started sharing the room with something else. His children, and grown now, with households of their own, noticed it, too, though none of them spoke of it directly for a long while, having learned across their own lifetimes not to comment on their father's moods, even the encouraging ones, for fear of somehow disturbing whatever fragile balance had produced them. His eldest son, the same one who had learned as a young man to pause at the gate and read the household's weather before entering, found himself on a visit some years after the grove, sitting with his father through an entire evening meal without once needing to manage anything. No careful footsteps, no reading of cups set down on tables, not just an ordinary conversation between an old man and his grown son, the kind of conversation that should have been unremarkable and instead felt, to the son, like something he hadn't realized he'd spent his whole life wanting. And He asked his father eventually, carefully, what had actually happened that day in the grove, having heard only fragments over the years, never the whole of it. Bharadvaja told him, not in roughly the same plain terms he'd once told his wife, that he'd gone looking for a fight and found a man who simply wouldn't fight him, and that something about being handed his own fury back, untouched, had done more to him than any argument anyone had ever won against him in 70 years of arguments. His son sat with that for a while and then said quietly that he wished someone had told him this when he was young enough for it to have changed how he'd grown up in that house. Bharadvaja didn't argue with him. He simply said that he wished the same thing, and that this was, as far as he could tell, the closest either of them was likely to get to an apology large enough to match what there was to apologize for. Not a single perfect sentence, just an old man, finally willing to say plainly that he understood now what the fire had cost the people who'd had to live closest to it. Think back for a moment, that boy standing over a broken jar at the very beginning of this story. The one whose rage was always too large for whatever small thing had triggered it. The one nobody around him ever stopped to ask what the larger thing underneath it might actually be. That question sat unanswered for almost his entire life. It's worth asking now at the end whether the grove finally gave him something like an answer, even if it arrived 70 years later than it might have. It probably did, at least in part. The fire he carried from childhood was never really about jars, or shipments of grain, or servants who brought the wrong dish, or a brother who chose a different robe. It was about a small boy who learned far too early. That anger was the only language in his house anyone seemed to actually hear. He spent the rest of his life speaking it fluently, long after the original reason for learning it had stopped applying to almost anything in front of him. It's worth saying plainly, here near the end, that this story has not been an argument that anger is always wrong, or that every person who feels it is somehow at fault for feeling it. Anatha Pindika felt the sting of being publicly accused and did not pretend otherwise. Padakara's grief in its rawest early days carried real fury inside it before it became wisdom. Thich Nhat Hanh never claimed the war didn't deserve his rage. The argument this story has been quietly making, chapter after chapter, is narrower and, in its own way, more hopeful than a simple condemnation of anger itself. That what determines a life isn't whether the fire ever sparks, because it will in everyone given the right conditions. What determines a life is what happens in the moments just after the spark, whether it's fed, defended, built into an identity, or simply allowed to be seen clearly enough that it eventually burns itself down to something a person can actually live alongside. And remember, too, the image from a little earlier in this telling, Thich Nhat Hanh, holding his own grief at a devastating war the way you'd hold a crying infant, not fighting the crying, not silencing it, just holding it close enough that it could finally settle. Bharadvaja never used those words, never heard that teaching directly, but something close to it is what happened to him in that grove, even if no one there described it that way at the time. For 70 years, every time his own anger cried out, he had met it with more noise, more force, certain that was the only way to make it stop. In the grove, for the first time, someone simply declined to add to the noise, and in that silence, his own fire, with nothing left to fight, finally had room to be heard rather than simply obeyed. There are 3 things worth carrying out of this story with you beyond the details of any single part of it. The first is this. Anger almost always feels like self-defense from the inside, and it is almost always, in the end, self-inflicted. The old image of the hot coal holds up under almost any amount of scrutiny. You cannot pick it up to throw at someone else without it burning your own hand first, regardless of whether it ever reaches its target, regardless of whether the person you're aiming at even notices. Bharadvaja spent a lifetime believing his fury was a weapon aimed outward. It was, in fact, the one thing in his life that never once stopped burning him specifically. The second is this. Every person in this story who managed to stop anger from landing, Anatha Pindika in the marketplace, Visakha with a hostile mother-in-law, Punna under a hail of stones, the teacher in the grove himself, wasn't suppressing some enormous effort of willpower in the heat of the moment. They had simply decided, long before the provocation arrived, and what kind of person they intended to be regardless of what anyone else brought to the encounter. The decision happens earlier than the provocation, almost always. By the time the insult or the injury actually arrives, the real work has either already been done or it hasn't, and there usually isn't enough time left in that instant to do it from scratch. And the third, the one that matters most, if you take only one thing from everything you've just heard, you are not required to win the argument your whole life has been preparing you to lose. You don't have to keep laying out the feast year after year, certain that this time, finally, someone will come and sit down and eat it, and you'll finally feel whatever it is you've been hoping winning would make you feel. You're allowed to simply stop cooking it. You're allowed to notice the fire, name it, hold it the way you'd hold something crying out in pain rather than something demanding to be obeyed. And then simply to put it down. It will not happen all at once. It didn't happen all at once for Bharadvaja, and there's no particular reason to expect it would happen all at once for anyone else. But it can start. It started for him in a grove on an ordinary morning, with a question about a meal no one had come to share. What would it feel like? Just for one day to refuse the feast, not to win the argument, not to prove yourself right. Just to notice the fire rising and let it rise, and let it pass, without handing it anything to burn. I'd love to know, down in the comments, where in your own life you're still cooking a meal nobody's coming to eat. If there's one image worth carrying out of this entire story and into whatever sleep follows it, let it be this one. A boy standing over a broken jar, certain the whole world has just wronged him, and an old man decades later, finally setting down a feast that was never going to be eaten no matter how many more years he spent preparing it. The distance between those two moments was his whole life. The distance between noticing your own fire and actually setting it down doesn't have to take nearly that long if you let yourself notice a little sooner than he did. He died, by most accounts, an old man at peace with far more of his life than he had any particular right to expect, given how much of it he'd spent at war with people who had mostly just wanted to bring him the right dish, on time, without being shouted at for the wrong one. The jar he broke as a boy was long forgotten by everyone except perhaps by him. The first small fire in a story that took an entire lifetime to finally learn it didn't have to keep burning everything it touched. Santi, peace. Not the absence of fire entirely, just the quiet, hard-won space that opens up once you finally stop feeding it.